The clear waters of Talisar stretched to the horizon, their depths hiding both bounty and peril in equal measure. It was on this oceanic world, one of the most prestigious planets within the realm of Ultramar, that Cato Sicarius was born in the late 41st millennium. Unlike many space marines whose origins were humble, peasants, hive dwellers, or feral worlders, Sicarius entered life as nobility, the firstborn son of the planetary governor. House Sicarius stood among Talisar's most ancient and honored dynasties, its bloodline stretching back to the earliest days of Ultramar's colonization. The family had provided the planet with leaders, military commanders, and administrators for thousands of years, their names synonymous with duty and excellence. Young Cato's childhood unfolded within marble-columned estates overlooking the vast Talisari seas, where he was groomed from his earliest days to continue this legacy of leadership. The aristocratic upbringing of Cato Sicarius differed dramatically from the hardscrabble existence most Astartes recruits endured before selection. While other future space marines learned survival through necessity, fighting daily battles against starvation or violence, Sicarius received formal education in strategy, rhetoric, and martial arts from the finest tutors on Talisar. His father ensured the boy understood the weight of command and the responsibilities of rulership, lessons that would later shape his approach to leadership within the Ultramarines. By his 10th year, young Cato had already distinguished himself in the formal dueling competitions held among Talisar's noble houses. His natural grace with a blade and tactical acumen drew attention not just from his peers, but from visiting Ultramarines who maintained a watchful eye for potential recruits among Ultramar's worlds. The boy's physical abilities were remarkable, but it was his absolute confidence, some might say arrogance, that truly set him apart. Where other children might doubt themselves, Sicarius never questioned his ability to triumph. When the Ultramarines recruitment officers arrived on Talisar for their generational selection of aspirants, Cato Sicarius stood at the front of the assembled candidates. Though only 12 standard Terran years old, he carried himself with the bearing of a seasoned officer. The trials on Talisar were particularly grueling, designed to test not only physical prowess but mental resilience and tactical thinking, qualities the Ultramarines prized above all others. The first trials involved swimming through Talisar's treacherous currents to reach a series of underwater caves, navigating by instinct through darkness, and returning with specific tokens hidden within. Several aspirants drowned. Others were taken by the predatory megafauna that patrolled the depths. Sicarius not only completed the challenge faster than any candidate in living memory, but returned with twice the required tokens. The second phase tested martial skill, pitting aspirants against combat servitors programmed with increasing levels of lethality. Where most candidates fought defensively, seeking merely to survive, Sicarius attacked with calculated aggression, exploiting weaknesses in the servitors' programming that veteran instructors had not anticipated. His performance bordered on the theatrical, a trait that would later define his combat style, yet none could deny its effectiveness. The final challenge examined leadership under pressure. Groups of aspirants were abandoned in Talisar's island archipelagos with minimal supplies and given impossible objectives to achieve. Most groups managed partial success through cooperation. Sicarius's team accomplished every objective, largely through his ability to identify and leverage the unique skills of each team member. Those who served with him reported that while he was demanding and occasionally harsh, his strategic insight was flawless. When the trials concluded, Sicarius ranked first among all candidates, his scores breaking several recruitment records. The apothecaries and chaplains noted something unusual in their assessment. Where most recruits showed potential to become excellent space marines, Sicarius displayed the qualities of a future captain even before receiving his first gene seed implant. His departure from Talisar marked both triumph and sacrifice. As firstborn son of the planetary governor, Sicarius had been groomed to eventually rule. By joining the Ultramarines, he abdicated this birthright, though some whispered that he merely exchanged one form of nobility for another, more prestigious one. His father, reports suggest, was not disappointed but proud. Having a son among the Emperor's finest warriors brought greater honor to House Sicarius than planetary governance ever could. The neophyte's transition to Fortress Hera on Muck Crag proved less challenging than for most recruits. The rigid discipline, hierarchical structure, and emphasis on proper conduct mirrored the aristocratic environment of his upbringing. While other aspirants struggled to adapt to the Ultramarines' exacting standards, Sicarius appeared to thrive, as though he had been preparing for this life since birth. The surgical procedures to implant the gene seed of Roboute Guilliman, the genetic material that would transform him from human to transhuman, proceeded with unusual smoothness. Apothecaries noted his body's exceptional compatibility with the Primarch's genetic legacy, as though Sicarius had been born specifically to receive these gifts. Each of the 19 organs that define a space marine integrated perfectly, from the secondary heart to the Becher's gland, from the oculobe to the black carapace. During this transformation, Sicarius studied the Codex Astartes with characteristic intensity. Where most neophytes struggled with Guilliman's complex tactical doctrines, Sicarius absorbed them effortlessly, often engaging his instructors in nuanced debates about specific applications of Codex principles. His questions sometimes bordered on challenging the text itself, not rejecting its wisdom, but probing its boundaries, a tendency that raised both admiration and concern among his trainers. Assignment to the 10th Company under Captain Guilliman marked Sicarius's formal beginning as a Scout Marine. The standard practice for all Ultramarines neophytes, this period of service allowed new recruits to prove themselves in actual combat, while their bodies completed the transformation into full Astartes. Most served in the Scout Company for decades. Sicarius remained for just 7 years. His time as a scout revealed both his greatest strengths and concerning flaws. In combat, Sicarius demonstrated uncanny situational awareness and an instinctive grasp of battlefield dynamics. During a campaign against Orc raiders in the Argent Stars, he led a small squad of scouts deep behind enemy lines to eliminate a mechboy workshop. Not only did they destroy the target, but Sicarius also identified and eliminated 3 additional priority targets not included in the original mission parameters, crippling the Orc force's heavy weapon capabilities. However, his reports from this period show a troubling pattern of exceeding mission parameters without authorization. Captain Guilliman's assessments praised Sicarius's initiative, but repeatedly noted concerns about his tendency to expand mission objectives based on his own judgment rather than deferring to command structures. This tension between brilliant improvisation and codex discipline would define much of Sicarius's career. His elevation to full battle brother came after the Corinth Crusade, where his actions during the siege of Drukian Fen earned him a marksman's honor. Assigned to the 8th Assault Company, Sicarius quickly distinguished himself in close quarters combat, his blade work approaching artistry. Veterans with centuries of service found themselves studying his technique, particularly his ability to transform standard codex maneuvers into unpredictable variants that maintain the tactical purpose while surprising opponents. Service in the 8th Company lasted just 5 years before his transfer to the 4th Company, where his aptitude for combined arms operations became apparent. During the scouring of Quintarn, Sicarius coordinated Devastator squads with Assault Marines in a series of precision strikes that systematically dismantled the heretic defense network. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar personally commended his innovative application of Codex principles. The most significant test of Sicarius's early career came during the Damnos campaign against Necron forces. As a sergeant in the 4th Company, he led a tactical squad cut off from the main force when Necron phalanxes emerged from hidden tomb complexes. Surrounded and outnumbered, Sicarius organized the scattered Ultramarine units into a coherent fighting retreat that preserved their strength until reinforcements arrived. His action saved 3 squads from certain destruction and earned him promotion to the 1st Company. Among the veterans of the 1st, Sicarius found himself surrounded by warriors whose experience far exceeded his own. Rather than being humbled, he redoubled his efforts, often training for 20 hours without rest, pushing his transhuman physiology to its limits. His determination to excel among these elite warriors bordered on obsession. Battle brothers from this period recall finding him alone in training cages at all hours, practicing blade forms or reviewing tactical simulations. His meteoric rise culminated with appointment as captain of the 2nd Company in the year 979 of the 41st millennium, following the death of Captain Severus Agamemnon in battle against Tyrannid splinter fleets. At just 63 years of age, extraordinarily young for such a position, Sicarius assumed command of the Ultramarines' prestigious battle company. The appointment raised eyebrows among some veterans who believed other, more experienced warriors had been overlooked. Marnius Calger's decision to elevate Sicarius reflected both recognition of his exceptional abilities and strategic foresight. The chapter master saw in the young officer qualities that mirrored Guilliman's own tactical genius, though perhaps without the Primarch's temperance and humility. Calger believed Sicarius's aggressive innovation, balanced by the rigid structure of the 2nd Company, would produce a commander of unparalleled effectiveness. The newly appointed captain immediately set about reforging the 2nd Company in his image. He instituted additional training regimens, particularly in blade work and close quarters combat. The company's already high standards rose further under his command, with some battle brothers requesting transfers to other companies, unable to meet Sicarius's exacting requirements. Those who remained, however, developed into one of the most effective fighting forces in the Imperium. Sicarius's personal heraldry, incorporating the crossed swords of Talisar with Ultramarines iconography, adorned his artificer armor, specially crafted by the chapter's master artificers. The mantle of the suzerain, an ancient relic denoting his position as leader of the Ultramarines' honor guard, draped his shoulders. The Tempest blade, a master-crafted power sword of extraordinary quality, became his signature weapon. In appearance as in action, everything about Sicarius projected exceptional status. His relationship with the Codex Astartes proved complex. On one hand, he could recite entire sections from memory, and insisted his company follow its organizational principles with absolute precision. On the other, his battlefield interpretations sometimes stretched Codex doctrine to its limits, particularly regarding acceptable risk thresholds. Where the Codex counseled methodical advancement, Sicarius often sought decisive, rapid strikes at critical vulnerabilities, accepting greater casualties for quicker victory. This approach troubled Calger, who recognized its effectiveness but worried about its sustainability and the example it set. During the Zeist campaign, Sicarius led the 2nd Company in a bold assault against Tau firebase installations that broke the Xenos line but cost the lives of 17 battle brothers, losses that more conservative tactics might have avoided. When questioned by the chapter master, Sicarius justified his decisions with flawless citations from the Codex regarding calculated risk and strategic necessity. The tension between Sicarius and Calger never erupted into open disagreement, but those close to the chapter's command structure noted the growing philosophical divide. Calger embodied the traditional Ultramarine virtues of careful planning, strategic patience, and collective action. Sicarius, while paying lip service to these principles, increasingly emphasized personal heroism, decisive action, and calculated gambles. The transition from captain of the 2nd Company to master of the watch came as a natural progression for Cato Sicarius. This prestigious title, one of the chapter's highest honors, carried with it the solemn duty of overseeing the defense of Macragge itself, the heart of Ultramar and sacred homeworld of the Ultramarines. The appointment reflected not only Calger's recognition of Sicarius's tactical acumen, but also his understanding that the young captain's aggressive tendencies might be better channeled toward defensive operations, where caution naturally tempered boldness. The Office of the Watch operated from the imposing fortress of Hera, its command center built into the northern polar defense complex. From this vantage point, Sicarius could monitor the entirety of Macragge's defensive grid, a network of orbital platforms, surface-to-void missile silos, and automated response systems that represented one of the most sophisticated planetary defense architectures in the Imperium. Ancient technologies dating back to the Great Crusade interlinked with newer innovations, creating a layered defense that had withstood countless threats over 10,000 years. Sicarius approached this responsibility with characteristic thoroughness, spending his first month as master systematically reviewing every aspect of Macragge's defenses. He personally inspected each orbital platform, often arriving unannounced to evaluate readiness. The defense crews, accustomed to quarterly inspections, found themselves subjected to monthly or even weekly evaluations. Many officers initially resented this increased scrutiny, but Sicarius's meticulous attention to detail identified critical vulnerabilities that had gone unnoticed for decades. One of his most significant early reforms addressed response time. Historical data from the First Tyrannic War showed that Hive Fleet Behemoth had penetrated outer system defenses with alarming speed, giving defenders precious little time to coordinate their efforts. Sicarius instituted what became known as the Talisarian Response Protocol, a system that decentralized initial defense authority, allowing local commanders to mobilize forces without waiting for confirmation from the central command structure. This reduced average response time from 17 minutes to under 5, an improvement that would later prove crucial during several Void-borne incursions. The defense of Macragge extended beyond the planet itself to encompass the entire Macragge system. Sicarius reorganized the patrol patterns of the system's defense fleet, implementing an unpredictable rotation schedule based on mathematical formulas rather than standard patterns. Enemy forces attempting to map patrol routes for infiltration would find the information obsolete within hours, forcing them to either risk detection or waste resources on continuous surveillance. Perhaps most importantly, Sicarius recognized that Macragge's greatest vulnerability lay not in its technology, but in its people. The planetary defense forces, while well-equipped and trained to Imperial Guard standards, lacked the coordination and tactical flexibility to effectively support Astartes' operations during a major assault. Drawing on his aristocratic background and understanding of mortal psychology, Sicarius implemented new training protocols for PDF forces specifically designed to integrate their operations with Space Marine deployments. These exercises, conducted quarterly across Macragge's major population centers, simulated various invasion scenarios ranging from small-scale raids to full planetary assaults. PDF commanders participated in joint planning sessions with Ultramarine officers, learning to anticipate Astartes' tactical decisions rather than merely reacting to them. The result was a defense force that understood its role not as the primary combatant but as a force multiplier, securing supply lines, holding secondary objectives, and channeling enemy forces toward areas where Astartes could engage them most effectively. Sicarius's reforms extended to void warfare as well. The battle for Macragge during the First Tyrannic War had demonstrated the limitations of conventional naval tactics against unconventional enemies. The Tyrannid bioships had ignored damage that would cripple normal vessels, rendering standard void warfare doctrines largely ineffective. Sicarius studied these encounters exhaustively, consulting with both the chapter's librarians and the tech marines to develop new approaches. The resulting void interdiction patterns represented a significant departure from Imperial Navy doctrines. Rather than concentrating firepower on enemy capital ships, Sicarius's approach prioritized disrupting enemy formation cohesion, particularly against swarm-type attackers like Tyrannids or Orc fleets. Specialized targeting matrices were developed to identify and eliminate command and control nodes within enemy formations, even when these weren't obvious from conventional augur readings. To test these theories, Sicarius organized the largest void warfare exercises seen in Ultramar since the Scouring. The chapter fleet divided into opposing forces, with one side adopting various Xenos or heretic tactics, while the other implemented the new defensive protocols. The exercises revealed both strengths and weaknesses in Sicarius's approach, allowing for refinement before implementation. By the third year of his tenure as Master of the Watch, Macragge's void defenses had been completely transformed, incorporating lessons not only from historical battles but from these practical simulations. Within the Second Company itself, Sicarius instituted a command structure that balanced codex organization with personal innovation. While maintaining the standard 10 squads prescribed by the Codex Astartes, he implemented an internal rotation system where squad sergeants periodically exchanged responsibilities, ensuring each could function effectively in different tactical roles. This cross-training created a more flexible command cadre, capable of adapting to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Sergeant Gaius Prabian, leader of the 2nd Company's 1st Squad, served as Sicarius's de facto second-in-command. A veteran of 2 centuries service with extensive experience in void operations, Prabian complemented Sicarius's aggressive tendencies with methodical planning and attention to logistical details. Their partnership proved particularly effective during the Jotun Uprising, where Prabian's careful preparation allowed Sicarius's bold strike against the rebel leadership to proceed without the supply issues that had plagued similar operations. Sergeant Severus Augeman of the 4th Squad specialized in heavy weapons deployment and fire support coordination. His background in the Devastator squads gave him unique insight into maximizing the effectiveness of the company's heavier armaments. Under Sicarius's direction, Augeman developed new applications for grav weapons in void-borne boarding actions, using their unique properties to create localized gravity distortions that disrupted enemy movements in the confined spaces of spacecraft. The 7th Squad, led by Sergeant Pausanias Lysane, focused on reconnaissance and forward deployment. Lysane had served briefly with the Scout Company as an instructor before joining the 2nd, giving him valuable experience in covert operations. Sicarius frequently deployed Lysane's squad ahead of main forces to gather intelligence and prepare the battlefield. During the defense of Arachnes Prime, Lysane's squad infiltrated heretic lines 3 days before the main Ultramarine force arrived, sabotaging defense lasers and communication arrays to ensure the success of Sicarius's subsequent assault. This command structure allowed Sicarius to delegate operational details while maintaining strategic oversight, freeing him to focus on broader defensive planning for Macragge itself. His officers understood his expectations and tactical preferences, often anticipating his orders before they were issued. This deep familiarity created an almost intuitive coordination within the company that outside observers frequently mistook for psychic communication. The most profound influence on Sicarius's defensive strategies came from extensive study of the First Tyrannic War, particularly the battle for Macragge. This conflict, which had nearly resulted in the destruction of the chapter homeworld, provided sobering lessons about the limitations of even the most sophisticated defenses when faced with an unprecedented threat. Sicarius spent countless hours in the chapter's librarium, reviewing tactical logs and after-action reports from that desperate conflict. What emerged from this study was a fundamental reassessment of defensive doctrine. The traditional approach, establishing a perimeter and concentrating forces at likely ingress points, had proven disastrously inadequate against the Tyrannid swarms, which simply overwhelmed defenses through sheer numbers. Sicarius instead developed what he termed defense in depth with mobile counterattack, a system that deliberately yielded outer defenses to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones where rapidly redeploying forces could engage them from multiple vectors. This approach required a complete redesign of Macragge's orbital defense grid. Rather than positioning defense platforms in a uniform sphere around the planet, Sicarius created deliberate gaps in coverage, false vulnerabilities that would tempt attackers into specific approaches. These corridors were heavily monitored and covered by overlapping fields of fire from concealed weapons platforms, allowing defenders to ambush forces that believed they had found a weakness in Macragge's defenses. The ground-based component of this strategy involved the creation of rapid response forces drawn primarily from the 2nd Company, but supplemented by elements of the 6th Company and the 9th Company. These forces maintained constant readiness, able to deploy anywhere on Macragge within 30 minutes via Thunderhawk gunships or teleportarium arrays. Regular drills kept response times minimal, with teams competing to improve their deployment speeds. Sicarius's defensive innovations extended to civilian protection as well. The First Tyrannic War had seen tremendous casualties among Macragge's population, particularly in the southern polar region. Working with planetary authorities, Sicarius oversaw the construction of hardened civilian shelters throughout major population centers, each designed to withstand orbital bombardment and equipped with supplies to sustain occupants for up to 6 months. These shelters incorporated hidden access tunnels that allowed defenders to move civilians safely even during active combat operations. To ensure these defensive systems functioned as intended, Sicarius instituted what became known as unannounced readiness evaluations, essentially surprise drills that tested both military and civilian response protocols without prior warning. The first such exercise caused considerable confusion and some resentment among planetary authorities, but after Sicarius presented the results, showing that nearly 40% of defense systems had failed to activate properly, opposition to the practice diminished. The most controversial aspect of Sicarius's tenure as Master of the Watch involved his relationship with the planetary defense forces. Traditionally, these forces operated under civilian authority, with the Ultramarines providing training and support but respecting the chain of command. Sicarius, however, insisted on direct operational control of PDF units designated as Astartes support forces, effectively creating a two-tier system within Macragge's military. This arrangement caused tension with planetary governors, who saw it as undermining their authority. The matter came to a head during the Garan conflict, when a rebellion on a neighboring world threatened to spill over into the Macragge system. Sicarius mobilized PDF rapid response units without consulting the planetary governor, deploying them to secure potential landing zones before the rebel forces could establish a foothold. While tactically sound, this action sparked a formal complaint to Chapter Master Calgar, who was forced to mediate between his Master of the Watch and the civilian authorities. The compromise that emerged granted Sicarius operational control of designated PDF units during active threats, but required consultation with civilian leadership, except in cases of immediate danger. This arrangement, while imperfect, recognized both the technical expertise of the Astartes and the legitimate authority of Macragge's civilian government. It also established a precedent for similar arrangements throughout Ultramar, standardizing the relationship between planetary forces and their Astartes protectors. Among the many titles adorning Cato Sicarius's formal introductions, Grand Duke of Talassar carried unique significance. Unlike his other honorifics, Knight Champion of Macragge, Master of the Watch, Captain of the Ultramarines' Second Company, this title connected him to his birthworld and represented responsibilities beyond his duties as an Astartes. The feudal governance structure of Ultramar meant that even after his transformation into a space marine, Sicarius retained noble obligations to his homeworld. Talassar, an oceanic world of scattered archipelagos and vast underwater cities, maintained traditions dating back to the Great Crusade. When Guilliman established the governance of Ultramar, he recognized the value of existing noble houses in providing stability and continuity. House Sicarius had ruled portions of Talassar for millennia, and the Primarch saw no reason to disrupt this arrangement, instead incorporating it into his broader administrative framework. The title of Grand Duke traditionally belonged to the head of House Sicarius, passing from father to eldest son in an unbroken line stretching back to the earliest days of imperial rule. When young Cato joined the Ultramarines, this created a potential succession crisis. Normally, his ascension to the ranks of the Astartes would have required him to renounce all familial titles and obligations, as Space Marines serve the Emperor above all earthly concerns. However, Talassarian tradition offered a unique solution. The Planetary Council petitioned Chapter Master Calgar, requesting that Cato retain his ducal title as a symbolic position, with day-to-day governance handled by appointed regents. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It maintained the prestige of House Sicarius, strengthened ties between Talassar and the chapter, and provided the planet with a powerful advocate within the Ultramarines hierarchy. Calgar, recognizing both the political advantages and the precedent established by Guilliman himself, approved this unusual arrangement. Thus, Cato Sicarius became one of the few Astartes to maintain formal noble responsibilities outside his chapter duties. The title was not merely ceremonial, it carried genuine authority and obligations that Sicarius fulfilled with characteristic thoroughness. The governance structure Sicarius established for Talassar reflected his military background while respecting local traditions. Rather than appointing a single regent, he created a tripartite council consisting of his younger brother Decimus, Admiral Helena Varro, and High Judicar Quintus Severin. This council handled routine matters, referring major decisions to Sicarius during his quarterly visits to the planet. These visits became significant events in Thalassarian culture. The arrival of the Grand Duke's personal Thunderhawk, painted in the blue and gold of the Ultramarines, but bearing the oceanic symbols of House Sicarius, would trigger weeks of ceremonies, administrative reviews, and public appearances. Sicarius approached these duties with the same precision he brought to military operations, reviewing economic reports and infrastructure projects with meticulous attention to detail. The most important of these ceremonial duties occurred during the Festival of Tides, Thalassar's most sacred annual celebration. This week-long event commemorated the planet's successful terraforming during the Dark Age of technology, when ancient machines had stabilized the world's oceanic ecosystem. As Grand Duke, Sicarius performed the Blessing of the Deeps, a ritual where he would dive into Thalassar's deepest oceanic trench, carrying a ceremonial spear tipped with adamantium. The successful return from these dangerous waters symbolized the continued prosperity of the planet. Sicarius approached this ritual not as mere ceremony, but as a genuine challenge. Thalassar's oceans contained predators capable of threatening even an Astartes, particularly in the lightless abyssal zones where pressure could compromise even power armor. Rather than using technological aids to simplify the dive, Sicarius insisted on performing it according to ancient tradition, using only his transhuman physiology and minimal breathing apparatus. Several times, he returned bearing scars from encounters with the legendary leviathans that patrolled the depths, adding to his mystique among the population. His relationship with Thalassar's citizens differed markedly from his interactions with battle brothers or imperial officials. Where the captain of the Second Company was known for his demanding standards and occasional arrogance, the Grand Duke of Thalassar displayed unexpected patience when dealing with civilian concerns. During public audiences, held in the ancient Posidium Palace overlooking Thalassar's capital archipelago, Sicarius would listen to petitions from citizens of all social strata, from humble fishermen to wealthy trade factors. This more approachable aspect of his personality surprised many who knew him only by his martial reputation. Ultramarines who accompanied him during these visits often remarked on the contrast. Sergeant Agamemnon once noted that Sicarius seemed to understand that leadership of civilians required different qualities than command of Astartes, that inspiration rather than demand yielded better results from unaugmented humans. The economic policies Sicarius implemented on Thalassar reflected a blend of practical military thinking and aristocratic noblesse oblige. He directed significant investment toward the planet's shipbuilding industry, particularly the construction of specialized vessels designed for void combat in dense asteroid fields or unstable warp conditions. These ships, incorporating design elements from Astartes strike cruisers, became highly sought after throughout Ultramar and beyond, creating a lucrative export industry that strengthened Thalassar's economy. Simultaneously, he established the Ducal Foundation for Oceanic Preservation, which worked to maintain Thalassar's delicate marine ecosystems against the pressures of increased industrialization. This balance between development and conservation earned him respect from both the merchant guilds and the traditional fishing communities that formed the backbone of Thalassarian society. Education received particular attention under Sicarius's governance. The Grand Duke established military academies on each major archipelago, personally designing curricula that emphasized naval tactics, void warfare, and amphibious operations. These academies served as feeder institutions for both the planetary defense forces and the Imperial Navy, with the most promising students occasionally selected for testing by ultramarine apothecaries. Though few would ultimately join the Astartes, many became officers in Ultramar's military forces, creating a network of commanders trained in Sicarius's tactical philosophies. The influence of Thalassar's oceanic culture on Sicarius's military thinking became increasingly apparent throughout his career. The planet's naval traditions emphasized mobility, deception, and striking from unexpected vectors, concepts that Sicarius incorporated into his command of the Second Company. During the Damnos campaign against Necron forces, he employed what became known as tide tactics, rapid advances followed by calculated withdrawals designed to draw enemy forces into compromising positions, much as Thalassarian fishermen used the planet's powerful currents to guide schools of fish into their nets. His approach to void warfare similarly reflected oceanic principles. Traditional Imperial Navy doctrine treated void ships like terrestrial fortresses, emphasizing broadside engagements and head-on assaults. Sicarius instead developed tactics that utilized three-dimensional space more effectively, with vessels approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously, mimicking the hunting patterns of Thalassar's apex predators. During the Gothic War, a fleet employing these techniques under his command destroyed an Orc cruiser squadron while suffering minimal casualties, demonstrating the effectiveness of this approach against numerically superior forces. Perhaps most significantly, Sicarius pioneered new approaches to amphibious warfare that revolutionized how the Ultramarines conducted planetary assaults. Traditional doctrine called for establishing beachheads and expanding outward, a methodical approach codified in the Codex Astartes. Sicarius instead developed what he termed deep strike amphibious deployment, where Astartes forces would be inserted far inland via submersible craft, emerging from rivers or lakes to strike at enemy positions from unexpected directions. This technique proved particularly effective during the Quintarn campaign against Tyranid forces. While the Xenos concentrated their defensive organisms along coastlines, anticipating conventional landings, Sicarius led elements of the Second Company upriver systems in specially modified land speeders equipped with limited submersible capabilities. Emerging behind Tyranid lines, they destroyed 3 major synaptic nodes before the hive mind could redirect its forces, crippling the swarm's coordination and allowing conventional forces to establish beachheads with minimal resistance. The political dimension of Sicarius's dual role created both opportunities and challenges. As Grand Duke of Thalassar, he held a seat on the Ultramar Council of Lords, the governing body that administered the realm under Calgar's ultimate authority. This position gave him influence beyond his military rank, allowing him to shape policy throughout Ultramar's 500 worlds. It also placed him in direct competition with other noble houses, some of which had their own representatives within the Ultramarines chapter. House Ventress of Calth, which had produced several notable Astartes, including Captain Uriel Ventress of the Fourth Company, maintained a particularly complex relationship with House Sicarius. The two families had been rivals since the Great Crusade, competing for influence within Guilliman's realm. This ancient competition occasionally surfaced in the professional relationship between Cato Sicarius and Uriel Ventress, though both warriors maintained the discipline expected of Ultramarines. During debates in the Council of Lords, Sicarius consistently advocated for increased military preparedness throughout Ultramar, often clashing with representatives from agricultural worlds who prioritized economic development. His arguments typically emphasized external threats, particularly the growing Tyranid presence in the eastern fringe and the resurgent Necron dynasties awakening throughout the sector. While some counselors dismissed these warnings as the natural bias of a military commander, events frequently vindicated Sicarius's concerns. The most significant political challenge Sicarius faced came from House Decimus of Espandor, whose patriarch, Lord Marshal Decimus, commanded Ultramar's PDF forces. Decimus, a veteran of the Imperial Guard who had earned his nobility through military service rather than birth, viewed Sicarius's aristocratic mannerisms with thinly veiled contempt. Their disagreements came to a head during the Jotun crisis, when rebellion threatened several outlying worlds of Ultramar. Decimus advocated a conventional military response, deploying PDF regiments to suppress the uprising through overwhelming force. Sicarius instead proposed a more targeted approach, using small teams of Astartes to eliminate rebel leadership while addressing the legitimate grievances that had sparked the unrest. The debate grew heated, with Decimus accusing Sicarius of soft-heartedness unbefitting a space marine, while Sicarius questioned whether Decimus understood the difference between compliance and governance. Calgar ultimately sided with Sicarius, implementing his proposed solution with significant success. The rebellion collapsed within weeks, with minimal civilian casualties and limited infrastructure damage. This outcome strengthened Sicarius's political position, but deepened the rift with House Decimus, creating a factional division within the council that would persist for years. Despite these political complications, Sicarius's governance of Talassar remained remarkably effective. The planet's economic output increased steadily under his direction, while its military contributions to Ultramar's defense exceeded expectations. The training academies he established produced officers of exceptional quality, many of whom went on to distinguished careers throughout the Imperium. Even his harshest critics acknowledged that Talassar prospered under his leadership, despite his limited time on the planet. This success stemmed partly from Sicarius's ability to identify and empower capable subordinates. Unlike his command style within the Second Company, where he maintained tight control over operations, his approach to planetary governance emphasized delegation and initiative. The Tripartite Council operated with considerable autonomy, consulting him on major decisions, but handling day-to-day administration independently. This arrangement allowed Talassar to benefit from Sicarius's strategic vision without requiring his constant presence. The martial prowess of Cato Sicarius became legendary even among the superhuman warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. While many space marines achieved remarkable feats of combat, Sicarius elevated battlefield performance to an art form that inspired awe among allies and dread among enemies. His reputation as a swordsman first emerged during the Ultramar Games of the year 982 of the 41st millennium, a quadrennial competition where the finest warriors of the chapter tested their skills against one another in contests of strength, marksmanship, and blade work. The 982 games marked Sicarius's first participation as captain of the Second Company. Traditional protocol dictated that company captains served as judges rather than competitors, but Sicarius insisted on entering the individual blade competitions, citing ancient precedents from the time of Guilliman. His performance in the opening rounds drew crowds of battle brothers who should have been attending to other duties, as he dispatched opponents with techniques that blended Codex-approved forms with innovations developed during his years on Talassar. The semi-final match against brother Sergeant Cronus of the First Company became particularly noteworthy. Cronus, better known for his mastery of armored warfare than personal combat, nonetheless possessed considerable skill with a blade. For 17 minutes, the two warriors exchanged blows at speeds barely visible to unaugmented human observers. Sicarius eventually prevailed with a technique later documented in training manuals as the Talassarian Tempest, a series of feints followed by a horizontal slash that bypassed Cronus's guard. The final match pitted Sicarius against Chaplain Orton Cassius, whose centuries of experience made him the clear favorite despite his primary role as spiritual leader rather than frontline combatant. Sicarius approached this bout with uncharacteristic caution, recognizing that Cassius's Crozius Arcanum represented both a potent weapon and a symbol of imperial authority. The match extended nearly 30 minutes, with neither warrior gaining clear advantage until Sicarius executed a maneuver that seemed to defy both gravity and anatomy, dropping into a backward roll while simultaneously extending his practiced blade to score the decisive touch against Cassius's throat guard. This victory established Sicarius as the preeminent swordsman within the chapter, a title he successfully defended in the subsequent games of 986 and 990. By the third competition, many potential challengers declined to participate, considering the outcome predetermined. This reluctance frustrated Sicarius, who valued these contests as opportunities to refine his techniques against worthy opponents. In response, he established the Blade Conclave, a weekly gathering where warriors of all ranks could challenge the captain to practice bouts without the formality or public scrutiny of the games. The Blade Conclave revealed a side of Sicarius rarely seen in battlefield operations, that of mentor and teacher. Warriors who attended these sessions reported that the captain showed remarkable patience, often pausing matches to demonstrate techniques or explain the reasoning behind particular moves. This pedagogical approach contrasted sharply with his battlefield persona, where he expected immediate compliance and perfect execution from his subordinates. Central to Sicarius's combat effectiveness was his distinctive wargear, particularly his power sword. Though often misidentified in imperial records as the Tempest Blade, his weapon was a master-crafted relic power sword of ancient provenance. Chapter artificers had modified the weapon specifically for Sicarius, incorporating energy-focusing crystals from Talisar's deep ocean trenches that gave the blade its characteristic azure glow when activated. The sword's power field generator had been calibrated to operate at frequencies slightly higher than standard, creating a disruptive effect when contacting other energy fields. This modification proved particularly effective against the invulnerable shields generated by Chaos Space Marines and the conversion fields utilized by certain Xeno species. During the purging of Vorleys, Sicarius's blade penetrated the warp-enhanced armor of a Wordbearer's champion when conventional weapons had proven ineffective, ending a heretic incursion that had threatened the entire subsector. Complementing his blade, Sicarius wielded a plasma pistol, modified by Master of the Forge Fenia's Maxim, to address the weapon's tendency toward catastrophic overheating. Maxim had incorporated heat sink technology recovered from a pre-heresy archaeological site on Calth, allowing the pistol to fire at maximum power settings with reduced risk. Sicarius typically employed this weapon to eliminate heavily armored targets before closing to blade range, a tactic that maximized his combat effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary risk. His artificer armor represented the pinnacle of ultramarine craftsmanship, combining traditional design elements with practical modifications based on combat experience. The breastplate incorporated fragments of armor worn by chapter heroes during the battle for Macragge, symbolically connecting Sicarius to this pivotal moment in ultramarine history. Microscopic runes inscribed across the ceramite surface contained excerpts from the Codex Astartes related to leadership and combat doctrine, visible only under magnification, but serving as a constant reminder of Guilliman's teachings. The armor's most distinctive feature was its elaborate heraldry, which combined ultramarine iconography with personal elements reflecting Sicarius's achievements and heritage. The right pauldron displayed the Second Company's heraldic badge, an inverted omega symbol, while the left bore the skull and laurel emblem of the Ultramarines. Gold filigree depicting oceanic motifs from Talisar adorned the armor's trim, becoming more elaborate with each major victory as artificers added commemorative elements. Practical modifications distinguished the armor from merely ceremonial plate. The vambraces contained integrated combat stimulant injectors that could deliver targeted biochemical enhancements during extended engagements. The greaves incorporated stabilization systems that improved balance during complex blade maneuvers, allowing Sicarius to execute techniques that would unbalance warriors in standard plate. The helmet's auto senses had been calibrated specifically for Sicarius's enhanced reaction time, providing information at rates that would overwhelm most space marines. The mantle of the suzerain, draped across his shoulders, served both ceremonial and practical purposes. This ancient garment, woven from materials that defied conventional analysis, generated a localized disruption field that could deflect energy weapons and obscure targeting systems. During the defense of Dias Prime, the mantle absorbed a direct hit from a dark Eldar splinter cannon that should have penetrated Sicarius's armor, allowing him to continue leading the counter-assault that ultimately repelled the Xenos raiders. Sicarius's combat record against notable enemies spanned dozens of worlds and hundreds of engagements. His first significant personal triumph came during the Balor Crusade, where he faced Autarch Ithrin of Craftworld Eandon in single combat. The Eldar commander, a veteran of thousands of years of warfare, wielded a singing spear whose psychically attuned crystal tip could penetrate ceramite with ease. For several minutes, the two commanders circled each other amid the broader chaos of battle, each seeking advantage. The duel ended when Sicarius executed a feint that exploited the Eldar's precognitive abilities, initiating a strike that appeared to target the Autarch's left side, but contained a subtle hesitation that caused Ithran to defend against a blow that hadn't yet materialized. This momentary misalignment in the Eldar's defense created an opening that Sicarius exploited with characteristic precision, his power sword severing the Autarch's primary arm at the shoulder. Though Ithran survived through emergency teleportation, the psychological impact of this defeat rippled through the Eldar forces, disrupting their coordination and contributing significantly to the Imperial victory. Against Orc opponents, Sicarius employed dramatically different tactics. During the Balaran cleansing, he faced Warboss Grimskull, a massive greenskin whose crude but effective power claw had claimed the lives of 3 Space Marine captains from other chapters. Rather than engaging in the protracted duel the Orc clearly desired, Sicarius executed what witnesses described as a mathematical approach to combat, systematically targeting the greenskin's joint structures with precisely calculated strikes while evading the powerful but predictable sweeps of the power claw. Within 40 seconds, Sicarius had inflicted 17 wounds to critical mobility points without receiving a single hit in return. As Grimskull's movements grew increasingly compromised, Sicarius launched his decisive attack, a thrust that bypassed the Orc's crude armor to penetrate its primary heart. What made this victory particularly impressive was not merely the kill itself, but the clinical efficiency with which Sicarius had dismantled a physically superior opponent through technical superiority. His engagements with Chaos forces revealed yet another dimension of his combat capabilities. During the Purging of Vorleys, Sicarius confronted Garul the Anointed, a champion of the Word Bearers whose armor had been infused with warp energies that allowed him to anticipate conventional attacks. The heretic wielded twin power axes, whose heads flickered with unnatural flames that left reality-scorching trails as they moved through the air. Sicarius approached this duel with cold calculation, recognizing that the Chaos Champion's warp-enhanced perceptions created both advantages and vulnerabilities. Rather than relying on technique alone, he incorporated randomness into his attack pattern, allowing muscle memory and instinct to guide certain strikes while maintaining conscious control of others. This unpredictable approach confused Garul's warp-granted foresight, creating openings that a more structured combat style would not have generated. The duel's conclusion came when Sicarius deliberately allowed one of Garul's axes to graze his armor, creating the impression of a successful strike. As the Chaos Champion pressed what he perceived as advantage, Sicarius pivoted into what appeared to be an exposed position, but actually aligned perfectly for a thrust that penetrated the heretic's gorget, one of the few vulnerable points in his corrupted armor. The blade severed Garul's spinal column at the neck, ending both the duel and the Word Bearer's leadership in a single stroke. Perhaps his most impressive victory came against Necron opposition during the later stages of the Damnos campaign, when Overlord Zondrek led a counter-offensive against Ultramarine positions. Sicarius found himself facing the Necron Lord's bodyguard, Vargard Oberyn. The Necron warrior, whose phase, sword, and dimensional displacement abilities had already claimed the lives of 17 Ultramarines, represented a level of technological advancement that seemingly rendered conventional combat skills irrelevant. Sicarius countered these advantages through environmental awareness and tactical improvisation. Recognizing that Oberyn's teleportation technology relied on quantum positioning systems, he maneuvered the duel toward a natural formation of Blackstone, a material known to disrupt certain Necron technologies. As the Vargard's displacement capabilities became increasingly unreliable, Sicarius pressed his advantage with a series of strikes aimed not at destroying the nearly indestructible Necron, but at damaging specific components of its internal systems. The precision of these attacks demonstrated Sicarius's thorough study of Necron physiology. Each blow targeted connection points between major body segments, gradually compromising the Vargard's structural integrity until a final strike separated its head from its shoulders. Though the Necron's self-repair protocols would eventually restore it, the temporary deactivation created a critical opportunity that Sicarius exploited to reach and damage Overlord Zondrek himself, forcing the Necron command structure into emergency phase-out and temporarily halting their offensive. The psychological impact of Sicarius's combat prowess extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages of eliminating enemy commanders. Imperial forces fighting alongside the Second Company frequently reported increased morale and combat effectiveness simply from witnessing Sicarius in action. During the liberation of Quintarn, Imperial Guard units that had been on the verge of breaking under Tyranid pressure rallied after observing Sicarius dispatch a Hive Tyrant in single combat, holding their positions against overwhelming odds until reinforcements arrived. This inspirational effect operated even more powerfully within the Ultramarines themselves. Battle brothers assigned to the Second Company developed a particular esprit de corps centered on their captain's reputation, striving to meet the exceptional standards he established. Training accidents increased noticeably among newly assigned Marines as they pushed themselves beyond safe limits in attempts to match Sicarius's performance metrics. Chaplains found themselves counseling warriors who felt they had failed their captain when they could not achieve the near impossible standards he seemed to set effortlessly. For enemy forces, Sicarius's reputation created effects ranging from caution to outright fear. Tactical analysis of multiple engagements revealed that opposing commanders frequently allocated disproportionate resources to sectors where Sicarius was known to be operating, creating vulnerabilities elsewhere that Ultramarine forces could exploit. During the Zeist campaign, Tau commanders diverted an entire hunter cadre to eliminate Sicarius, leaving their flank exposed to a devastating assault by elements of the First Company that ultimately broke their defensive line. Some enemies developed specific countermeasures targeting Sicarius personally. Dark Eldar raiders from the cabal of the Poisoned Tongue created specialized toxins designed to penetrate Astartes' physiology based on genetic samples recovered from battlefields where Sicarius had fought. Orc mechs constructed crude but dangerous devices specifically intended to counter the fighting style they had observed him employing. These efforts rarely succeeded, but demonstrated the psychological impact his reputation had on even the most alien minds. The Orc invasion of Black Reach began with typical greenskin subtlety, none whatsoever. Warboss Zanzag's fleet emerged from the warp in a disorganized cluster of ramshackle vessels, their engines belching toxic fumes visible from 3 systems away. Imperial Augur arrays detected the approaching Xenos Armada 2 weeks before they reached the outer planets of the Black Reach system, giving the defenders precious time to prepare. What should have been a straightforward defense operation, however, would soon become one of Cato Sicarius's most controversial campaigns. Black Reach itself represented a strategic linchpin in the Ultima Segmentum's defensive network. The system contained valuable promethium refineries on its 3rd planet and served as a crucial waypoint for supply convoys supporting Imperial operations throughout the sector. Its loss would create a dangerous gap in Imperial logistics, potentially compromising multiple ongoing campaigns. When reports of the approaching Orc fleet reached Ma Crag, Chapter Master Calgar immediately dispatched the Second Company under Sicarius's command to reinforce the system's defenses. Upon arrival, Sicarius found a troubling situation. The system's PDF forces, while reasonably well equipped, suffered from outdated tactical doctrines and leadership complacency. The planetary governor, Lord Maximilian Vore, had focused resources on protecting the promethium refineries at the expense of population centers, creating dangerous vulnerabilities in the defensive perimeter. Most concerning, intelligence reports indicated that Warboss Zanzag commanded not just a typical raiding party, but a full-fledged WA, with dozens of subordinate warbosses united under his brutal leadership. Sicarius immediately recognized that conventional defensive strategies would fail against the overwhelming Orc numbers. The Codex Astartes prescribed a specific approach to such scenarios: establish hardened defensive positions at critical infrastructure, conduct targeted strikes to eliminate enemy leadership, and gradually wear down the attacking force through superior discipline and firepower. This doctrine had proven effective against countless Orc invasions throughout Imperial history. Yet Sicarius saw a fundamental flaw in this approach when applied to the specific circumstances of Black Reach. The system's scattered habitats and industrial centers created too many potential targets to defend effectively with his limited forces. Following Codex doctrine would mean sacrificing numerous civilian populations to protect strategic assets, an outcome Sicarius found unacceptable both tactically and morally. Instead, he developed what would later be termed the Sicarian offensive defense, a radical departure from established Ultramarine doctrine. Rather than dispersing his forces to defend fixed positions, Sicarius concentrated the entire Second Company into a single strike force, supported by the most mobile elements of the PDF. This force would not defend territory, but would instead maintain constant offensive pressure against the Orc leadership structure, preventing the Greenskins from consolidating their forces or establishing effective supply lines. The first implementation of this strategy came as the Orc vanguard made planetfall near the Argus Prometheum complex. Rather than reinforcing the complex's defenses as Governor Vor demanded, Sicarius deployed his entire company via drop pod directly into the heart of the landing zone. The sudden appearance of 100 power armored warriors in the midst of the Orc formation created immediate chaos, with greenskin units firing indiscriminately at both the Ultramarines and each other. Sicarius had calculated this psychological impact precisely. Orc forces rely on momentum and the confidence inspired by overwhelming numbers. By inserting his warriors directly into their formation, he disrupted both advantages simultaneously. The Second Company formed a circular defensive position immediately upon landing, with tactical squads creating a ring of bolter fire, while assault squads conducted targeted strikes against Orc heavy weapons teams. Most significantly, Sicarius implemented a drop pattern that deliberately violated Codex guidelines, where the Codex prescribed dispersed landings to maximize tactical flexibility. Sicarius concentrated his drop pods in a tight cluster, creating a single point of overwhelming force. This pattern, later designated Sicarius Pattern Alpha, placed command elements at the formation center with combat squads arranged in concentric rings of decreasing veteran status, essentially inverting the traditional deployment that positioned veterans at the vanguard. The effectiveness of this approach became immediately apparent. Orc forces, attempting to respond to the threat at their center, found themselves channeled into killing zones where overlapping fields of fire decimated their numbers. When greenskin reinforcements arrived from orbit, they landed at predetermined coordinates expecting to join an advancing force, only to find scattered bands of survivors fleeing from the Ultramarine position. Within 6 hours, what should have been the establishment of an Orc beachhead had become a rout, with nearly 60% of the initial landing force destroyed or scattered. The Second Company suffered only 7 casualties, all non-fatal. Before the Greenskins could reorganize, Sicarius had already loaded his forces onto Thunderhawk gunships and departed for the next landing zone, leaving PDF forces to eliminate the remaining disorganized Orcs. This pattern repeated across 3 more landing zones over the following week. Each time, Sicarius refined his approach based on observed Orc responses, creating increasingly effective kill ratios. By the 8th day of the invasion, Warboss Zanzag found himself in an unprecedented situation. His forces were making planetfall successfully, but failing to establish any permanent presence on the surface. The psychological impact on the Orc leadership became evident in their increasingly desperate tactics, with landing craft attempting to disperse across wider areas rather than concentrating force as Orc doctrine typically demanded. Sicarius had effectively reversed the traditional dynamic of Orc invasions. Normally, defenders found themselves responding reactively to Orc movements, gradually losing ground as the greenskin numbers overwhelmed fixed positions. On Black Reach, the Orcs found themselves constantly reacting to Ultramarine strikes, never able to build the momentum so crucial to their morale and fighting effectiveness. The most controversial aspect of Sicarius's approach emerged in his use of PDF forces. Rather than integrating them directly into his strike force, where their lesser training and equipment would have made them vulnerable, he deployed them as a secondary wave following each Ultramarine assault. Their role was not to engage in direct combat, but to secure landing zones after the Second Company had moved on, eliminating wounded greenskins and establishing temporary defensive positions that created the illusion of permanent Imperial presence. This approach violated several Codex principles regarding the proper integration of Astartes and mortal forces. Traditional doctrine emphasized the inspirational value of Space Marines fighting alongside human troops, raising morale through their superhuman example. Sicarius instead treated the PDF as a separate operational element with distinct objectives, effectively creating a two-tiered combat doctrine that some critics later characterized as treating mortal soldiers as little more than cleanup crews. Despite these controversies, the effectiveness of Sicarius's approach became undeniable as the campaign progressed. By the third week, Orc landings had decreased by nearly 70%, with many greenskin transport ships remaining in orbit rather than risking the now predictable destruction that awaited them on the surface. This orbital concentration created the opportunity for the second phase of Sicarius's strategy. With the majority of the Orc fleet now holding position in high anchor above Black Reach's northern hemisphere, Sicarius executed what Imperial historians would later call his most brilliant and reckless maneuver of the campaign. Rather than requesting void support from the Ultramarine fleet, which would have taken days to arrive, he repurposed 12 PDF atmospheric fighters, equipping them with modified teleport homers salvaged from damaged drop pods. These fighters, piloted by PDF volunteers, conducted a high-speed pass through the center of the Orc fleet, broadcasting teleportation coordinates directly into the largest vessel, Warboss Zanzag's personal cruiser, De Final Crump. Before the Orcs could intercept these small craft, the coordinates had been successfully transmitted to the Ultramarine strike cruiser, Valen's Revenge, holding position behind Black Reach's moon. What followed was a boarding action that violated virtually every principle of void warfare established in the Codex Astartes. Rather than teleporting a small elite force aimed at sabotage or assassination, as doctrine prescribed for strikes against enemy flagships, Sicarius teleported the entire second company directly into the heart of Zanzag's vessel. The power requirements for such a massive teleportation nearly overloaded the strike cruiser systems, creating a brief but dangerous period where the vessel was effectively defenseless. The risk proved worthwhile. The sudden appearance of 100 Ultramarines in the cruiser's central chambers threw the Orc crew into complete disarray. Sicarius had calculated his insertion point precisely, materializing his forces in a rough sphere surrounding the ship's crewed bridge equivalent. Tactical squads established firing positions covering all major access points, while assault squads cleared adjacent compartments with brutal efficiency. Sicarius himself, accompanied by his command squad, drove directly toward Zanzag's position. The warboss, alerted to the boarding action, had gathered his largest and most vicious bodyguards in preparation for the assault. What followed was not the careful, methodical clearance operation prescribed by the Codex, but a headlong charge into the teeth of the Orc leadership. The confrontation between Sicarius and Zanzag occurred in the cruiser's engine room, a cavernous chamber filled with smoke and the constant roar of poorly maintained machinery. The warboss stood nearly 3 times Sicarius's height, his crude power claw crackling with unstable energy fields. Behind him, a dozen knobs formed a wall of green muscle and scavenged armor, each carrying weapons capable of tearing through ceramite with ease. Sicarius approached this uneven confrontation with characteristic confidence. Rather than engaging the knobs directly, he activated a teleport homer that brought a Devastator squad directly into position behind the Orc formation. The sudden eruption of heavy bolter fire from their rear caused the knobs to turn in confusion, creating the opening Sicarius needed. The captain covered the distance to Zanzag in 3 seconds, his power sword tracing a blue arc through the smoke-filled chamber. The warboss, more tactically astute than most of his kind, anticipated the charge and swung his power claw in a devastating arc. Rather than evading, Sicarius executed a maneuver that witnesses later struggled to describe coherently, a combination of slide and roll that brought him directly under the claw's path and into the warboss's guard. The Tempest blade struck upward, penetrating Zanzag's crude armor at the joint between arm and shoulder. The power field disrupted both flesh and the mechanical components of the power claw, temporarily paralyzing the massive limb. Before the warboss could respond with his secondary weapons, Sicarius had already repositioned, striking at the back of Zanzag's knee joint and bringing the massive greenskin crashing down to the deck plates. The final blow came not as a dramatic decapitation, as might have been expected from Sicarius's reputation, but as a precisely calculated thrust that penetrated the warboss's primary heart. As Zanzag collapsed, Sicarius was already issuing orders for the next phase of the operation, seemingly unconcerned with the significance of having slain the leader of an entire Wa in single combat. With Zanzag eliminated, the second company proceeded to systematically disable the cruiser's critical systems. Rather than destroying the vessel completely, which would have scattered the Orc fleet into numerous smaller, potentially more dangerous groups, Sicarius ordered the ship's crude navigation and communication systems left partially functional but subtly sabotaged. When the Ultramarines withdrew 2 hours later, the cruiser appeared largely intact from external observation. The psychological warfare aspect of this approach became clear in the following days. The cruiser, still recognized by the Orc fleet as their flagship, began broadcasting garbled and contradictory orders. The sabotaged navigation systems caused the massive vessel to drift slowly, but inexorably toward Black Reach's gravity well, creating the impression that Zanzag was ordering a full planetary assault. As subordinate warbosses attempted to follow what they believed were their leader's commands, they found themselves drawn into carefully prepared killing zones, where PDF artillery and the second company's mobile strike teams decimated their landing craft. The confusion in the Orc command structure prevented any coordinated response, effectively transforming what had been a unified Wa into dozens of disconnected, competing warbands. The campaign's conclusion came not through a decisive final battle, but through the gradual disintegration of Orc cohesion. Without Zanzag's brutal leadership, long-simmering rivalries between subordinate warbosses erupted into open conflict. Within 3 weeks of the boarding action, the Orc fleet had fractured completely, with many vessels departing the system in search of less challenging targets or turning against former allies in struggles for dominance. The aftermath of Black Reach brought both accolades and criticism for Sicarius. The campaign's success was undeniable. What should have been a year-long war of attrition had been resolved in under 2 months with minimal Imperial casualties. The second company had suffered only 23 wounded and 3 dead, an almost unprecedented casualty ratio when facing an Orc Wa of this magnitude. Yet the methods Sicarius employed generated significant controversy within Ultramarine command circles. Captain Guilliman of the First Company formally questioned the boarding action's deviation from Codex protocols, arguing that such tactical innovations, while effective in this instance, undermined the disciplined approach that defined the chapter's combat doctrine. Chaplain Cassius, while acknowledging the victory's importance, expressed concern about the example set by such willful departures from established procedures. Most significantly, Chief Librarian Tigurius submitted a detailed analysis to Chapter Master Calgar, highlighting both the brilliance and the danger of Sicarius's approach. The report praised the captain's adaptive thinking and undeniable results, while warning that such personalized combat doctrines risked creating dependency on individual leaders rather than the institutional framework that had sustained the Ultramarines for 10 millennia. The frozen world of Damnos represented everything the Ultramarines were sworn to protect, an imperial mining colony whose tithe of rare minerals supported forge worlds across the sector. When the first tremors shook the primary mining complexes in 973, planetary officials dismissed them as natural geological events. They could not have been more wrong. Deep beneath Damnos' icy crust, ancient Necron tomb complexes were awakening after millions of years of dormancy, their automated systems responding to unknown triggers that roused the metallic warriors from their stasis crypts. The initial Necron assault emerged without warning from beneath Damnos' northern ice cap. Skeletal warriors of living metal phased through solid rock into the heart of mining colony Axe 39, their Gauss weapons reducing miners to molecular ash before alarms could even sound. Within hours, 3 major population centers had fallen, their inhabitants either fleeing in terror or reduced to component atoms by the relentless Necron advance. Planetary defense forces deployed to contain the threat found their Law's weapons almost useless against necrodermis bodies that sealed ruptures almost as quickly as they were inflicted. Astropathic distress calls reached Crag 6 days after the initial emergence. Chapter Master Calgar, recognizing the severity of the threat, dispatched the second company under Sicarius's command to assess and neutralize the Xenos' incursion. The deployment represented Sicarius's first major engagement against Necron forces, an enemy whose capabilities were poorly understood even by the chapter's extensive tactical databases. The Codex Astartes contained limited information on these ancient adversaries, with most tactical recommendations based on fragmentary accounts rather than comprehensive analysis. Sicarius approached this knowledge gap with characteristic confidence. During the warp transit to Damnos, he immersed himself in every available record of Necron encounters, developing theoretical response strategies for various combat scenarios. His command staff noted that these plans emphasized aggressive counter-assault rather than the defensive containment typically employed against unknown Xenos threats. When questioned by Sergeant Tellian about this approach, Sicarius reportedly cited obscure passages from Guilliman's original manuscripts, suggesting that implacable foes respond best to overwhelming force applied precisely. The Ultramarines strike force arrived at Damnos to find a deteriorating situation. Nearly 60% of the planet's surface had fallen under Necron control, with remaining Imperial forces consolidated around Kellenport, the primary spaceport and largest population center. The planet's governor had been killed in the initial assault, leaving defense coordination to a coalition of mining guild officials and PDF officers with limited strategic experience. Rather than establishing a defensive perimeter around Kellenport as local authorities requested, Sicarius ordered an immediate reconnaissance enforced to assess Necron capabilities firsthand. The second company deployed via Thunderhawk to the outskirts of Eurasian Mining Complex, a recently fallen facility where auger arrays had detected ongoing Necron activity. Tactical doctrine called for careful observation and limited engagement to gather intelligence. Instead, Sicarius led a full company assault directly into the complex. The initial phase of the operation appeared successful. Ultramarine forces penetrated the outer perimeter with minimal resistance, encountering only scattered groups of basic Necron warriors whose predictable attack patterns were easily countered. Bolter fire proved minimally effective against necrodermis bodies, but concentrated plasma discharges could overwhelm their self-repair protocols, permanently deactivating the metallic constructs. As the company pushed deeper into the complex, Sicarius ordered his squads to collect disabled Necron components for later analysis, believing these artifacts would provide insights into enemy vulnerabilities. This decision would prove disastrous. The damaged Necron components contained microscopic transmission nodes that continued functioning even when the warrior frames appeared inactive. Each collected piece broadcast the Astartes' position and movements to the tomb complex below, allowing the Necron command structure, later identified as belonging to the Sodek dynasty, to precisely track Ultramarine deployments and prepare an appropriate counter-strike. That counter-strike came 3 hours into the operation. As Sicarius led his command squad toward what appeared to be a central control chamber, the metallic floor beneath them liquefied and reformed into a phalanx of Lich-Guard, elite Necron warriors wielding hyperphase swords and dispersion shields. Simultaneously, teleportation flares announced the arrival of Deathmarks, Necron snipers whose synaptic disintegrators targeted neural pathways even through Astartes' power armor. The second company found itself fighting an enemy that had anticipated their every move. Squads attempting to maneuver to supporting positions encountered pre-positioned Canoptech wraiths that phased through solid walls to attack from unexpected angles. When Devastator squads established firing positions to cover potential withdrawal routes, they discovered those positions already targeted by doomed scythes, whose particle beams cut through reinforced rockcrete with terrifying precision. Sicarius responded to this deteriorating situation with both tactical brilliance and fatal overconfidence. Recognizing the need to break contact and regroup, he ordered a fighting withdrawal toward the surface. However, rather than leading this retreat personally, he advanced deeper into the complex with his command squad, intent on identifying and eliminating the Necron leadership coordinating the ambush. This decision split the company's forces at the moment when cohesion was most critical. The main body of the Second Company, under Sergeant Sicarius's second-in-command, executed a textbook fighting withdrawal, using breaching charges to create alternative egress routes when primary corridors proved compromised. Though suffering mounting casualties from Deathmark fire and Wraith ambushes, they maintained unit cohesion and supported wounded battle brothers with disciplined covering fire. Their adherence to Codex protocols for disengagement from superior forces likely prevented the complete destruction of the company. Sicarius and his command squad faced a different scenario entirely. Pushing toward the complex's central chamber, they encountered increasingly sophisticated Necron resistance. Triarch Praetorians wielding Rod of Covenant weapons established interlocking fields of fire that restricted movement options. Cryptex, Necron technical specialists, deployed chronometron devices that created localized temporal distortions, causing bolter rounds to slow to visible speeds mid-flight and power armor servos to lag critical microseconds behind neural impulses. The confrontation reached its climax when Sicarius's squad breached the central chamber to find not a conventional command center, but a resurrection node where damaged Necron warriors were being reconstituted from molecular level. Presiding over this process stood Overlord Zondrek and his eternal bodyguard Vargard Oberyn, the leadership core of the Sautek forces on Damnos. Zondrek, a Necron commander whose mental patterns dated back to the war in Heaven 60 million years earlier, had anticipated Sicarius's aggressive tendencies and prepared accordingly. The ensuing combat exposed the limitations of even Sicarius's vaunted blade work against Necron elite units. His power sword, devastating against organic opponents, struggled to penetrate the quantum phase shields generated by Lichguard dispersion fields. When he engaged Oberyn directly, the Vargard's phase shifter allowed the Necron to literally step through Sicarius's attacks, materializing at optimal positions for devastating counter-strikes. For perhaps the first time in his combat career, Sicarius found himself genuinely overmatched. A sweeping blow from Oberyn's warscythe penetrated his artificer armor at the shoulder joint, severing primary nerve bundles and compromising the limb's functionality. A second strike shattered his breastplate, damaging the primary heart beneath. Only the intervention of Apothecary Phineas, who deployed a stasis grenade that temporarily froze the Necron advance, prevented Sicarius's death in that chamber. The withdrawal from the complex became a desperate fighting retreat. Two members of the command squad sacrificed themselves to secure an escape route, detonating melta charges that collapsed a major access tunnel behind the survivors. Sicarius, despite grievous injuries that would have incapacitated even an Astartes of lesser constitution, refused evacuation by teleport Homer, insisting on leading the remaining forces back to extraction points through his own power of will. This first engagement with the Necrons of Damnos ended in clear defeat for the Ultramarines. Of the 100 battle brothers who had entered the mining complex, 37 returned with injuries requiring extensive apothecary attention. 12 had been lost completely, their gene seed unrecoverable as their bodies were reduced to constituent atoms by Gauss weapons or captured by Canoptech constructs for analysis. The Second Company, accustomed to victory under Sicarius's leadership, found itself retreating from the field in disarray. Sicarius's injuries proved extensive enough to require dreadnought internment had they been suffered by a lesser space marine. The Overlord's warscythe had severed primary nerve bundles in his right shoulder, compromising motor control throughout the arm. More concerning, molecular-level damage from Gauss weapon grazing hits resisted normal Astartes healing processes, requiring extensive reconstruction by Apothecary Phineas. For 3 days, Sicarius remained in supervised suspension while his body fought to repair damage that defied conventional medical understanding. This period of forced inactivity provided the first opportunity for genuine reflection in Sicarius's otherwise relentlessly forward-moving career. The defeat at Eurasian mining complex represented not just a tactical failure, but a fundamental challenge to his self-conception as a warrior. His combat approach, aggressive, personally led assaults that overwhelmed opposition through superior skill and determination, had proven catastrophically ineffective against an enemy that could anticipate and counter such tactics. When Sicarius emerged from medical suspension, those close to him noted subtle but significant changes in his demeanor. The characteristic swagger had diminished, replaced by a more measured assessment of tactical options. During planning sessions for the defense of Kellenport, he demonstrated unprecedented willingness to consider alternative approaches, actively soliciting input from company sergeants rather than simply issuing directives. The defense of Kellenport itself represented a dramatic departure from Sicarius's typical operational approach. Rather than the mobile strike force tactics he had employed on Black Reach, he implemented a multi-layered defensive perimeter, incorporating both Astartes and PDF forces in complementary roles. Heavy weapons emplacements covered likely approach vectors, while underground sensor arrays, hastily adapted from mining equipment, provided early warning of Necron phase shifting infiltration attempts. Most significantly, Sicarius positioned himself not at the vanguard, but at a central command post where he could coordinate the overall defense rather than personally leading each counter-assault. This decision, while tactically sound, visibly cost him considerable emotional effort. Several battle brothers reported seeing their captain physically restraining himself from joining frontline engagements when Necron pressure intensified at particular sectors. The Necron assault on Kellenport began 7 days after the Eurasian complex defeat. Unlike their previous methodical advance, the Necrons attacked with overwhelming force across multiple vectors simultaneously, suggesting that Zondrek recognized the strategic importance of eliminating the last major Imperial stronghold. Ghost Arcs disgorged waves of warriors at the perimeter, while Night Scythes deployed Lichguard and Immortals directly into the city's central districts, bypassing outer defenses entirely. Sicarius's defensive plan demonstrated his growing tactical maturity. Rather than attempting to hold every district, he had established a series of concentric fallback positions, each more heavily fortified than the last. When outer districts fell to overwhelming numbers, defending forces withdrew in good order to secondary positions, avoiding the catastrophic losses that might have resulted from attempting to hold untenable ground. This approach conserved Astartes' strength while maximizing damage to Necron forces, who found themselves channeled into prepared killing zones where overlapping fields of fire could temporarily overwhelm their self-repair protocols. Despite these improved tactics, the fundamental problem remained. The Ultramarines lacked sufficient firepower to permanently destroy Necron forces. Warriors reduced to molten slag by plasma fire would phase out, returning to resurrection chambers deep beneath the surface before rejoining the assault hours later. The defenders found themselves engaged in a war of attrition they could not possibly win, with each Necron casualty representing only a temporary advantage, while each fallen Astartes or PDF trooper represented an irreplaceable loss. As the 6th day of continuous combat dawned, Sicarius faced the most difficult decision of his command career. Tactical projections indicated that Kellenport would fall within 24 hours regardless of defensive efforts. Thousands of civilians remained in the city, their evacuation impossible under constant Necron assault. The Codex Astartes was explicit in such situations. When defeat is inevitable, Astartes forces must withdraw to preserve gene seed and combat capability for future operations, even at the cost of civilian casualties. For Sicarius, who had built his reputation on victories snatched from seemingly impossible situations, this represented more than a tactical retreat. It required acknowledging a fundamental limitation, that some enemies could not be defeated through skill or determination alone, that sometimes strategic withdrawal represented the only viable option. This realization struck at the core of his identity as a warrior and leader. The evacuation order came 18 hours before projected defensive collapse. Ultramarine Thunderhawks, supported by the remaining PDF aircraft, established an air corridor to waiting transport ships, while the second company held a shrinking perimeter around the spaceport. Sicarius assigned each squad specific sectors to defend, with staggered withdrawal timetables designed to maintain maximum covering fire for civilian transports. Sicarius himself commanded the final rearguard, personally holding the primary access corridor to landing pad Primus as the last civilian transports prepared for emergency takeoff. With only his command squad and 2 tactical squads remaining on the surface, he faced the advancing Necron tide with grim determination. When Vargard Oberyn materialized at the head of a Lichguard phalanx, Sicarius engaged him directly, buying crucial minutes for the final transports to achieve minimum safe distance. This final duel differed markedly from their previous encounter. Where Sicarius had previously attacked with characteristic aggression, he now fought with calculated precision, focusing not on achieving victory, but on delaying the Necron advance. Each parry-and-counter strike served to hold position rather than press advantage, maintaining the defensive line until confirmation came that all transports had successfully departed. Only then did Sicarius order final evacuation, personally covering the withdrawal of his remaining battle brothers before boarding the last Thunderhawk. As the gunship accelerated toward orbit, auger arrays captured images of Necron forces overrunning the spaceport, their emotionless advance continuing despite the evacuation of their primary targets. Damnos had fallen, representing the first clear defeat of Sicarius's command career. The return to Ma Crag carried none of the triumph that typically accompanied the second company's arrivals. Though they had successfully evacuated over 20,000 civilians and preserved the majority of the company's fighting strength, the loss of Damnos represented a significant Imperial defeat. For Sicarius personally, it created a psychological wound potentially more significant than the physical injuries he had sustained. Chapter Master Calgar received Sicarius's report without the censure many expected. Records from this period suggest Calgar recognized the potential growth opportunity this defeat represented for his ambitious captain. Rather than relieving Sicarius of command, as some within the chapter suggested, Calgar instead assigned him to oversee the integration of Damnos refugees into Ultramar society, ensuring he witnessed firsthand the human consequences of the failed defense. This assignment proved transformative. Working directly with displaced civilians, many of whom had lost everything to the Necron advance, provided Sicarius with perspective rarely available to Astartes officers. Where he had previously viewed military operations primarily through the lens of tactical challenges and personal glory, he now confronted the fundamental purpose of the Ultramarines, the protection of humanity. The refugees' resilience in the face of catastrophic loss offered lessons in a different kind of courage than that displayed on the battlefield. Throughout this period, Sicarius immersed himself in studying Necron tactical data collected during the Damnos campaign. Working with Techmarine Fenias and librarian Vaunted Guilliman, he helped compile the most comprehensive analysis of Necron capabilities yet produced by the chapter. This document, later incorporated into Codex supplements, identified critical vulnerabilities in Necron command and control systems that would prove crucial during the eventual return to Damnos. That return would not come immediately. The Imperium faced numerous threats requiring the Ultramarines' attention, from Tyrannid splinter fleets to chaos incursions along the eastern fringe. Yet Sicarius never relinquished his determination to reclaim Damnos. During planning sessions for other campaigns, he would often reference the Fallen World, analyzing how tactics being developed might apply to an eventual counter-invasion. This focus bordered on obsession, though tempered by the hard-earned wisdom of his defeat. When the opportunity finally came in the year 991 of the 41st millennium, Sicarius had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for this moment. The planned Liberation Force dwarfed the original deployment, incorporating not only the full strength of the Second Company, but elements of the 1st, 3rd, and 10th Companies as well. Most significantly, the operation included substantial Adeptus Mechanicus assets, Titan Legion detachments, and Skitarii cohorts, whose advanced weaponry offered technological countermeasures to Necron phase technology. the galaxy changed forever when the Great Rift tore reality asunder. As warp storms of unprecedented magnitude ravaged the Imperium, countless worlds found themselves isolated and vulnerable. It was during this dark hour that the impossible occurred. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, returned to lead humanity in its darkest hour. While many Astartes witnessed this miraculous event with awe and reverence, Cato Sicarius's initial reaction was notably complex, a mixture of genuine loyalty and subtle disquiet. Sicarius had been en route to Terra when the catastrophic events of the 13th Black Crusade unfolded. His vessel, the Imperial cruiser Overlord, became trapped in the warp as the Great Rift formed, subjecting the Ultramarine captain and his honor guard to nightmarish trials. For what seemed like an eternity, they battled demonic entities that continuously assaulted their vessel. By the time the Overlord emerged into real space, Sicarius had endured horrors that left even his indomitable spirit shaken. His return to Ultramar coincided with the early stages of the Indomitus Crusade. The Sicarius who presented himself before the reborn Primarch was not the same warrior who had departed years earlier. Though he maintained his composure with characteristic discipline, those who knew him well noted subtle changes, a newfound hesitation before speaking, momentary flinches at unexpected movements, and a gaze that occasionally seemed focused on threats only he could perceive. Guilliman's assessment of Sicarius was characteristically thorough. The Primarch reviewed the captain's service record in detail, analyzing his tactical decisions, leadership style, and battlefield performances. What he found was a commander of exceptional ability whose personal ambition occasionally clouded his judgment, a warrior whose desire for glory sometimes overshadowed the methodical approach that defined the Ultramarines. Rather than censure or praise, Guilliman offered Sicarius something unexpected, a place in the Victrix Guard, his personal honor guard. This appointment generated considerable surprise throughout the chapter. While Sicarius's combat prowess certainly qualified him for such a role, many expected him to continue commanding the Second Company. Some interpreted the assignment as a subtle rebuke, Guilliman keeping a potentially problematic officer under his direct supervision. Others saw it as recognition of Sicarius's exceptional abilities, placing him where his talents could directly serve the Primarch's needs. The truth, as with most of Guilliman's decisions, contained elements of both perspectives. The Primarch recognized Sicarius's tactical brilliance and combat skills as valuable assets, but also perceived how the captain's personality had been shaped by an era of imperial decline that emphasized individual heroism over institutional strength. By incorporating Sicarius into his command structure, Guilliman sought to reshape this promising officer's understanding of leadership while utilizing his undeniable talents. Sicarius's initial adjustment to serving directly under the Primarch proved challenging. Where he had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy as a company captain, he now operated as one component of Guilliman's strategic apparatus. The Primarch's command style emphasized comprehensive planning, statistical analysis, and coordinated operations, a marked contrast to Sicarius's preference for decisive, often improvised action. During early strategy sessions, Sicarius frequently proposed aggressive approaches that Guilliman methodically dissected, exposing potential vulnerabilities that the captain had overlooked in his focus on offensive potential. These analytical dissections were not intended as humiliation, but as education. Guilliman had employed similar techniques during the Great Crusade to develop promising officers, challenging their assumptions and expanding their tactical perspectives. For Sicarius, accustomed to being the most capable strategist in any gathering, these sessions initially provoked resentment. Only gradually did he recognize their value, as Guilliman's broader strategic vision revealed patterns and possibilities that his more narrowly focused approach had missed. The relationship between Primarch and Captain evolved significantly during the battles of the Indomitus Crusade's first phase. At Vorles, Sicarius witnessed Guilliman's ability to coordinate multiple force elements with unprecedented precision, orchestrating a campaign that liberated the system with minimal casualties. On Connor, he observed how the Primarch balanced military objectives with civilian protection, never sacrificing one for the other. These experiences gradually reshaped Sicarius's understanding of leadership, tempering his aggressive instincts with greater strategic awareness. The introduction of Primaris Space Marines represented another significant adjustment for Sicarius. These new warriors, physically larger and more powerful than traditional Astartes, initially provoked skepticism throughout the Ultramarines chapter. For Sicarius, who had defined himself by his exceptional abilities even among the superhuman Astartes, the Primaris represented a potential challenge to his status. Their enhanced capabilities and fresh perspective threatened to render his hard-won experience obsolete. Guilliman, recognizing this potential friction, assigned Sicarius to oversee the integration of Primaris elements into Crusade battle groups. This responsibility forced the captain to work directly with these new warriors, evaluating their capabilities and developing tactics that maximized their effectiveness. Initial assessment reports submitted by Sicarius reflected his conflicted perspective, acknowledging the Primaris Marines' superior physical attributes while questioning their lack of battlefield experience and occasional rigidity in tactical application. The Primarch's response to these reports proved illuminating. Rather than dismissing Sicarius's concerns, Guilliman expanded his assignment, directing him to develop specialized training protocols that would blend traditional Astartes experience with Primaris capabilities. This project played to Sicarius's strengths as a combat innovator while addressing legitimate operational needs. The resulting Sicarian combat integration protocols became standard throughout the Indomitus Crusade, establishing Sicarius as an authority even among the Primaris officers. This new role gradually altered Sicarius's perspective on the Primaris Marines. Where he had initially viewed them as potential rivals, he began to recognize them as tools in his tactical arsenal, each with specific capabilities that could be leveraged for maximum effect. During the liberation of Gathalammer, he deployed aggressor squads as anchors for his defensive line, while using Inceptor units as mobile strike elements, creating a flexible combat formation that adapted to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The effectiveness of these combined arms tactics earned commendation from Guilliman himself, who incorporated several of Sicarius's innovations into broader Crusade doctrine. Sicarius's most significant contribution to the Indomitus Crusade came during the Espandor campaign against Death Guard forces. The Plague Marines had established a foothold in the system's outer planets, using them as bases to spread contagion throughout the sector. Conventional assault tactics had proven costly against these resilient opponents, whose diseased bodies could absorb punishment that would destroy normal adversaries. When initial Crusade elements became bogged down in attritional warfare, Guilliman assigned Sicarius to develop an alternative approach. The resulting operation demonstrated how profoundly Sicarius's tactical thinking had evolved under Guilliman's mentorship. Rather than the frontal assaults that had characterized his earlier campaigns, he designed a multi-layered strategy that targeted the Death Guard's command and control infrastructure. Utilizing Vanguard infiltrators to identify plague laboratories and communication nodes, he deployed precision strikes by Reaver squads supported by suppressors, systematically isolating Death Guard formations before engaging them with overwhelming force. Most impressively, Sicarius incorporated non-Astartes elements into his battle plan with unprecedented effectiveness. Imperial Navy assets provided void superiority that prevented reinforcement, while Adeptus Mechanicus specialists developed filtration systems that protected troops from airborne contagions. This comprehensive approach reflected Guilliman's strategic philosophy, viewing each engagement not as an isolated battle, but as one component of a broader campaign requiring coordinated effort across multiple Imperial organizations. The culmination of the Espandor campaign came at Plague Harbor, where Death Guard commander Festerlord Grolgath had established his headquarters within a massive biological structure that continuously generated new pathogens. Rather than assaulting this heavily defended position directly, Sicarius implemented what he termed a constriction pattern, establishing a perimeter of fortified positions that gradually tightened around the target, while specialized strike teams eliminated supporting infrastructure. This patient approach, distinctly unlike the aggressive tactics that had defined his earlier career, slowly deprived the Death Guard fortress of resources and reinforcement capabilities. When the final assault came, Sicarius led a specially equipped strike force, including both traditional Astartes and Primaris elements. Their armor had been modified with additional sealing and filtration systems, developed through collaboration with Adeptus Mechanicus Biologus specialists. These modifications allowed them to penetrate the plague-saturated environment of Grolgath's inner sanctum without succumbing to the myriad diseases that had claimed previous assault forces. The battle within the biological fortress tested even Sicarius's enhanced constitution. Necrotic fluids corroded armor seals, while mutated defenders emerged from pustulant walls to attack from unexpected angles. Throughout this nightmarish environment, Sicarius maintained unit cohesion with uncharacteristic patience, advancing methodically rather than pushing forward with his customary aggression. This disciplined approach minimized casualties while steadily progressing toward Grolgath's command chamber. The confrontation with the Festerlord himself demonstrated how Sicarius had adapted his combat style to address specific threats. Rather than engaging the bloated Death Guard commander directly, he coordinated a combined arms assault that systematically targeted the biological support systems, keeping the plague-ridden monstrosity functional. Only when these systems had been compromised did Sicarius deliver the killing blow, a precisely placed plasma discharge that ignited the methane gases accumulated within Grolgath's distended form, immolating the Chaos Champion from within. The victory at Espandor earned Sicarius formal recognition from Guilliman, who cited the operation as exemplary in its execution and strategic conception. More significantly, it represented a turning point in their professional relationship. Where the Primarch had previously treated Sicarius as a promising but flawed officer requiring guidance, he now increasingly consulted him on tactical matters, valuing his perspective particularly regarding adaptive response to unexpected battlefield developments. This evolution did not mean complete alignment between their approaches. Sicarius remained more willing to accept casualties to achieve objectives than Guilliman typically approved, while the Primarch's comprehensive planning sometimes struck Sicarius as excessively cautious. These differences occasionally surfaced during strategy sessions, with Sicarius advocating more aggressive timetables than Guilliman's methodical approach supported. Yet these disagreements now occurred within a framework of mutual respect rather than the subtle tension that had characterized their early interactions. As the Indomitus Crusade progressed, Sicarius found himself increasingly comfortable with his role within Guilliman's command structure. The position offered different satisfaction than his previous company command, fewer opportunities for personal glory but greater strategic impact. His tactical innovations shaped operations involving thousands of warriors across multiple systems, while his integration protocols became standard throughout not just the Ultramarines but many Primaris reinforced chapters. The most profound change occurred in Sicarius's self-perception, where he had once defined himself primarily through individual achievement and personal combat prowess. He began to measure success through broader strategic outcomes. During the Parmenio campaign, when a subordinate officer executed a brilliant but unauthorized assault that achieved tactical objectives while compromising the overall strategic plan, Sicarius delivered a reprimand that could have come from Guilliman himself, emphasizing how tactical success without strategic context represented failure rather than achievement. This transformation did not mean abandonment of the combat skills that had defined his earlier career. During the Battle of Rhokkos, when Guilliman's command position came under direct assault by Alpha Legion infiltrators, Sicarius demonstrated that his blade work remained unmatched. Moving with preternatural speed, he intercepted the assassination team before they could reach the Primarch, his power sword tracing patterns of lethal precision that left 8 traitor Astartes dead in less than 12 seconds. What distinguished this action from his previous combat performances was its purely defensive nature, focused entirely on protection rather than personal glory. Guilliman's assessment following this incident captured the essence of Sicarius's evolution. In a private communication to Chapter Master Calgar, the Primarch noted that while Sicarius remained prone to dramatic action, these tendencies were increasingly channeled toward appropriate objectives rather than self-aggrandizement. The officer who had once sought to make himself legendary was gradually becoming something potentially more valuable, a leader whose abilities served purposes beyond his own reputation. The Battle of Biel-Tan should have been another glorious campaign to add to Sicarius's already impressive record. The Craftworld, one of the most militant of the Eldar factions, had long been a thorn in the Imperium's side across multiple sectors. When intelligence reports indicated the Craftworld had been weakened by internal conflict, Imperial High Command saw an opportunity to eliminate a persistent threat. The Ultramarines, alongside elements from several other chapters and Imperial Guard regiments, were tasked with the assault. Sicarius commanded the Ultramarine contingent from his personal strike cruiser, the Emperor's Will. The vessel had served him faithfully through dozens of campaigns, its machine spirit seemingly attuned to his aggressive tactical style. As the Imperial Armada translated from the warp near Biel-Tan's last known coordinates, initial augur readings showed the Craftworld in disarray, with significant structural damage visible even at extreme range. The assault force prepared for immediate engagement, with Sicarius's strike team designated as the vanguard element. Before the Imperial fleet could close to engagement range, reality itself seemed to fracture around the Craftworld. What Imperial tacticians initially interpreted as some form of Eldar defensive measure quickly revealed itself as something far more catastrophic. A massive warp rift was opening, centered on Biel-Tan itself. Emergency Vox transmissions from forward elements reported glimpses of demonic entities manifesting throughout the Craftworld as its wraithbone structure buckled under otherworldly pressures. Guilliman, monitoring the operation from his command center in Ultramar, immediately ordered a full withdrawal. The Primarch recognized the signs of a major warp incursion that could potentially engulf the entire Imperial fleet. Most vessels complied immediately, their navigators plotting emergency translation coordinates to escape the expanding rift. The Emperor's Will, however, had pushed ahead of the main fleet in Sicarius's characteristic aggressive advance. By the time the retreat order reached them, warp disturbances were already interfering with navigation systems. Sicarius ordered emergency thrusters to pull back from the expanding anomaly, but the ship's machine spirit registered increasing disturbances in the material-immaterium boundary. Gellar field generators strained against pressures they were never designed to withstand as reality itself became thin around the vessel. The ship's navigator, an ancient woman who had guided the Emperor's Will for over 2 centuries, reported unprecedented warp turbulence that made conventional navigation impossible. The last Vox transmission from the Emperor's Will, received by the retreating Imperial fleet, contained only Sicarius's voice calmly requesting that Chapter Master Calgar be informed of their situation. Before he could complete the message, the transmission dissolved into static as the strike cruiser was enveloped by the expanding warp rift. Augur arrays on the retreating vessels recorded the Emperor's Will seemingly elongating, its structure distorting in impossible ways before vanishing entirely from material space. For the crew and Astartes aboard, the transition was experienced as a moment of impossible sensations. Reality seemed to invert, with solid bulkheads becoming transparent while the void of space gained substance and weight. Many mortal crew members died instantly, their minds unable to process the fundamental violation of natural law. Even the Ultramarines, with their enhanced physiologies and mental conditioning, experienced momentary disorientation as their senses reported contradictory information. Sicarius maintained consciousness through sheer force of will, his mind anchored by the rigorous mental disciplines taught to all Ultramarines. As awareness returned, he found himself in a command bridge transformed by warp exposure. Surfaces rippled with colors that had no names in human language, while chronometers ran backward, forward, or sideways with no discernible pattern. Most of the mortal crew lay dead at their stations, blood leaking from eyes and ears as their brains had hemorrhaged from exposure to unfiltered warp energies. The ship's Gellar field had not failed completely. A total collapse would have resulted in immediate demonic incursion and destruction of the vessel. Instead, the field fluctuated unpredictably, creating pockets of relative stability interspersed with zones where the immaterium bled directly into the ship's interior. Sicarius immediately recognized the existential threat this represented. Without stable gellar field protection, the ship and everyone aboard would soon fall victim to the predatory entities that inhabited the warp. His first priority was to establish a defensive perimeter around the bridge and engineering sections. The Ultramarines accompanying him, 30 battle brothers from his personal honor guard, were divided into 5-man squads and assigned to secure critical areas. Their bolt pistols were loaded with blessed ammunition, while power weapons were activated in anticipation of encounters that conventional firearms might prove ineffective against. The journey through the ship's corridors revealed the horrifying transformation already underway. In sections where the gellar field weakened, physical laws became suggestions rather than requirements. Gravity shifted direction unpredictably, causing unwary Marines to suddenly find themselves walking on walls or ceilings. Ambient temperature fluctuated wildly, with patches of corridor flash freezing, while adjacent sections heated to near molten temperatures. Most disturbing were the temporal anomalies. Battle brothers reported seeing phantom images of themselves performing actions they had not yet undertaken, while others experienced moments repeated in endless loops until they physically moved to different locations. The first demonic manifestations appeared within hours of their transition to the warp. In a cargo hold where several crew members had sought refuge, reality thinned enough for minor entities to slip through. By the time Sicarius' squad reached the location, they found only corpses arranged in ritualistic patterns, their blood forming symbols that hurt the mind to observe directly. The demons themselves were nowhere visible, having either returned to the warp or moved deeper into the ship in search of more victims. Sicarius established a systematic sweep protocol, with squads moving in coordinated patterns to clear the vessel section by section. The ship's size, nearly 4 kilometers from bow to stern, made complete clearance impossible with their limited numbers. Instead, they focused on establishing safe zones where surviving crew could be gathered and protected. The ship's chaplain, Brother Garrus, performed continuous rites of purification in these areas, strengthening the boundary between real space and the warp through faith and ritual. The most secure location proved to be the ship's reclusium, a chapel dedicated to the Emperor that contained sacred relics and icons. The inherent spiritual protection of this space, combined with the continuous prayers led by Chaplain Garrus, created a bubble of stability that resisted warp intrusion more effectively than any other area of the ship. Sicarius ordered all surviving crew members relocated to this space, creating a defensible redoubt that could be maintained indefinitely. With immediate survival addressed, Sicarius turned his attention to the broader situation. The ship's navigator had survived the initial transition but remained in a catatonic state, her mind overwhelmed by direct exposure to the raw immaterium. Without her guidance, conventional warp travel was impossible. The gellar field generators continued to function, but at reduced capacity, creating an unstable bubble of real space that prevented immediate destruction, but could not be maintained indefinitely as power reserves depleted. Most concerning was their location within the immaterium. Without navigational references, they had no way to determine their position relative to real space. The warp possessed no fixed geography, with distances and directions having no meaning in conventional terms. They were not simply lost in space, but lost in a dimension where the concept of location itself became fluid and unreliable. Sicarius convened a war council with his remaining officers to assess their options. The ship's tech marine, Brother Agrippa, reported that life support systems could be maintained for approximately 3 standard years, with careful rationing of resources. The warp engines remained functional but useless without navigational guidance. Conventional auger arrays returned only nonsensical readings when directed at the immaterium surrounding them. Their only potential salvation lay with the ship's astropathic choir. 3 of the 5 astropaths had survived the transition, though all showed signs of psychological trauma from the experience. Under normal circumstances, astropathic communication across the immaterium required precise knowledge of the senders' and recipients' locations in real space. Without such references, their psychic messages would disperse directionlessly into the warp, reaching no destination. The senior surviving astropath, a blind woman named Sarai who had served aboard Imperial vessels for over a century, proposed an alternative approach. Rather than attempting directed communication, they would broadcast an ongoing psychic beacon, a continuous signal that might be detected by Imperial psychers if the Emperors will ever drifted close enough to real space for the signal to penetrate the barrier between dimensions. This strategy required the astropaths to maintain continuous psychic activity, exposing themselves to the predatory entities of the warp for extended periods. The risk of possession or psychic burnout was extreme, but no safer alternative presented itself. Sicarius approved the plan while implementing strict protocols for monitoring the astropaths for signs of corruption. Chaplain Garrus would remain with them at all times, ready to execute any who showed evidence of warp influence. With survival and potential rescue plans established, Sicarius faced the challenge of maintaining discipline and purpose among both the Astartes and mortal crew during what might become an extended period of isolation. The psychological pressures of warp immersion affected even Space Marines, whose mental conditioning provided resistance but not immunity to the Immaterium's corrupting influence. For the mortal crew members, the strain was far more severe, with many developing paranoia, hallucinations, or catatonic withdrawal within the first weeks. Sicarius implemented a regimen drawn from Codex Astartes protocols for extended void deployment, adapted for their unique circumstances. Each battle brother was assigned both combat and non-combat responsibilities, ensuring constant activity that left minimal time for introspection or doubt. Physical training continued in modified form, with Marines practicing blade work and close-quarters combat techniques in the limited space available. Spiritual observances were expanded, with additional hours dedicated to meditation and prayer under Chaplain Garrus's guidance. For the mortal crew, Sicarius established a parallel structure of duties and observances. Those with technical skills were integrated into maintenance teams supervised by Brother Agrippa, while others were assigned to support roles that kept them continuously occupied. The ship's remaining officers maintained military discipline, with regular inspections and drills preventing the deterioration of morale and order that isolation might otherwise cause. Despite these measures, the corrupting influence of the warp found openings. The first casualty came 63 days into their ordeal, when a senior engine technician was discovered attempting to sabotage the Gellar field generators. Under interrogation, the man claimed that voices from between the walls had promised to guide the ship home if the fields were lowered. Sicarius personally executed the compromised crewman, using the incident to reinforce to all survivors the constant vigilance required against warp influence. More subtle corruption manifested in the dreams that plagued both Astartes and mortals. Survivors reported increasingly vivid nightmares featuring impossible architectures and entities that spoke in voices that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly within the mind. Chaplain Garrus instituted dream recording protocols, requiring all personnel to report their dreams for analysis to identify patterns that might indicate coordinated warp influence. Those experiencing recurring symbolic elements were placed under observation, with psychic screening by the astropaths when their primary duties permitted. The first direct demonic incursion occurred approximately 4 months into their drift. A fluctuation in the Gellar field allowed a group of lesser entities to manifest in the lower engineering decks. Resembling emaciated humanoids with too many joints and mirror-smooth skin, these creatures began systematically hunting isolated crew members, leaving bodies drained of all moisture and arranged in symbolic patterns that Chaplain Garrus identified as components of a larger summoning ritual. Sicarius led the response personally, taking 2 tactical squads into the compromised sections to eliminate the entities before they could complete whatever arcane purpose they served. The ensuing combat demonstrated why even minor warp entities posed such danger to mortal forces. The creatures moved in patterns that seemed to anticipate conventional tactics, appearing behind Astartes positions that should have been secure or momentarily phasing out of material existence when struck by bolt or fire. Sicarius adapted his approach, abandoning standard combat doctrines in favor of unpredictable movement patterns and attack rhythms that the demons could not anticipate. By varying his tactics constantly and attacking from directions that seemed tactically unsound, he created openings that more methodical approaches could not achieve. The other Ultramarines followed his example, breaking from their ingrained training to embrace a more fluid combat style that the warp entities struggled to counter. The battle lasted 17 hours, with the Ultramarines methodically clearing compartment after compartment. 5 battle brothers suffered wounds from the creature's crystalline claws, which seemed to pass through ceramite armor as if it were cloth. Apothecary Venter treated these injuries with a combination of conventional methods and spiritual purification, preventing the corruption that typically followed warp entity contact. The final demon was cornered in a maintenance shaft, where Sicarius confronted it alone after ordering his squad to seal the adjacent compartments. The entity, recognizing its isolation, attempted negotiation rather than combat, speaking in a voice that seemed to originate inside Sicarius's own mind. It offered knowledge of navigational paths through the immaterium that would return the ship to real space. The price for this knowledge was modest, merely permission to remain aboard as an advisor to the captain. Sicarius's response came in the form of his power sword, activated to maximum disruption field intensity and driven through the entity's crystalline form. As the creature dissolved back into the immaterium, its final psychic scream contained both rage and something that might have been respect for an adversary who could not be tempted even in the most desperate circumstances. This incident marked a turning point in their ordeal. The demonic incursion had tested their defenses and found them sufficient, while the attempted corruption of Sicarius himself had failed completely. Morale among both Astartes and mortal crew improved noticeably in the following weeks, with fewer reports of disturbing dreams or paranoid episodes. The shared triumph, however modest in conventional military terms, had reinforced their collective resilience against the warp's influence. The passage of time became increasingly difficult to measure as their isolation continued. Chronometers functioned erratically in the immaterium, sometimes running at different speeds in different parts of the ship. Sicarius established a system of rotating duty shifts to maintain some semblance of temporal structure, but the distinction between days and weeks gradually lost meaning as the ship drifted through timeless depths. Physical changes began to manifest in the mortal crew after approximately 1 standard year. Some developed minor mutations, subtle alterations like fingernails that grew in spiral patterns or eyes that reflected light with prismatic effects. Chaplain Garrus monitored these changes carefully, consulting ancient texts on warp exposure to distinguish between harmless physical adaptations and signs of genuine corruption. Those showing evidence of the latter were quietly executed, their bodies consigned to the plasma reactors to prevent any taint from spreading. The Ultramarines themselves proved more resistant to physical corruption, their genetically enhanced bodies and rigorous mental conditioning providing substantial protection against warp influence. Nevertheless, they too experienced subtle alterations. Several battle brothers reported enhanced sensory perception, particularly in low light conditions, while others developed an intuitive awareness of immaterial disturbances that preceded demonic manifestations. Sicarius documented these changes meticulously, recognizing their potential tactical value while remaining vigilant for signs that such gifts might come with hidden costs. Human contact with the wider Imperium finally came in the form of another vessel lost in the warp, an ancient merchant ship that had apparently been adrift in the immaterium for centuries. The Emperors will encountered this derelict during one of the periodic fluctuations that sometimes brought different regions of the warp into proximity regardless of their relationship in real space. Initial auger scans showed no life signs aboard, but structural integrity remained largely intact, suggesting potential salvageable resources. Sicarius led a boarding party personally, recognizing both the opportunity and danger such a vessel represented. The merchant ship's interior revealed a disturbing tableau. The crew appeared to have died at their stations, their bodies perfectly preserved, as if death had occurred moments rather than centuries earlier. More unsettling was the discovery that these corpses were not truly dead in the conventional sense. When approached, their eyes would track the movement of the boarding party, though their bodies remained motionless. The ship's logs, remarkably intact, revealed its fate. The vessel had become lost in the warp during the early 31st millennium, nearly 10,000 years earlier. Unable to return to real space, the crew had eventually turned to desperate measures, attempting to bargain with warp entities for safe passage. Whatever pact they made had preserved them in their current state, not truly alive, but prevented from experiencing the release of death, their consciousness trapped in immobile bodies for millennia. When Cato Sicarius finally returned to Ultramar, he emerged from the warp a fundamentally altered warrior. The strike cruiser Emperors will materialized in the Muck Crag system without warning, its hull bearing scars of impossible geometries and materials unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus specialists who later examined them. Auger arrays detected the vessel drifting on an erratic course toward the outer system, its engines inactive and void shields fluctuating in patterns that defied conventional analysis. The Ultramarines' response was immediate. 3 battle barges moved to intercept the returning vessel, their weapons locked but not activated, caution rather than welcome characterizing this reunion. Vox hails went unanswered for 17 minutes before a single transmission cut through the static. Sicarius's voice, recognizable but altered, reciting his name, rank, and identification codes in the precise cadence prescribed by Codex protocols for warriors returning from extended isolation. Boarding parties found the ship's interior transformed by its journey, corridors bent at angles that seemed to change when viewed from different perspectives. Ambient temperature varied wildly between compartments, with some sections preserved in vacuum like cold, while adjacent areas radiated heat that would have killed unaugmented humans. Most disturbing were the temporal anomalies. Chronometers throughout the vessel displayed different time measurements, with some running backward or cycling through the same minute repeatedly. Of the original complement of 30 Astartes and 200 mortal crew, only Sicarius and 7 battle brothers survived. The human crew had succumbed within the first year of warp immersion, their minds unable to withstand prolonged exposure to the immaterium, despite the protective rituals established by Chaplain Garrus. The surviving Ultramarines showed physical signs of their ordeal, premature aging, unusual scarification patterns, and eyes that seemed to focus on points slightly offset from what they appeared to be observing. Sicarius himself presented the most profound changes. His physical form remained intact, with no visible mutations or corruptions that might suggest chaotic influence. The alterations manifested instead in his demeanor and behavioral patterns. The swagger that had characterized his pre-warp personality was entirely absent, replaced by a stillness that senior librarians recognized as characteristic of those who had glimpsed the true nature of the immaterium and somehow retained their sanity. Apothecary Tiberius conducted the initial examination of the returned captain, following the stringent protocols established for warriors who had experienced extended warp exposure. Physical tests revealed several anomalies. Sicarius's reaction time had increased by approximately 15%, while his pain response showed significant dulling. More concerning were the neurological readings, which displayed activity patterns in regions of the brain normally dormant in Astartes' physiology. When questioned about these anomalies, Sicarius acknowledged awareness of the changes, but insisted they represented adaptation rather than corruption. The most rigorous scrutiny came from Chief Librarian Tigurius, whose psychic examination delved beyond physical alterations to assess Sicarius's spiritual integrity. The process lasted 27 hours, during which both participants remained in deep meditative states, while chaplains maintained continuous purification rituals around them. When Tigurius finally emerged, his assessment was cautiously favorable. He detected no evidence of demonic influence or chaotic taint, though he noted that Sicarius's psychic signature had been fundamentally altered by his experiences. Chapter Master Calgar, upon reviewing these assessments, faced a complex decision regarding Sicarius's future role within the chapter. The captain's tactical brilliance and combat skills remained invaluable assets, Yet his altered mental state raised legitimate concerns about his decision-making processes and potential vulnerability to warp influence. After consultation with both Tigurius and recently arrived Primaris chaplain Orton Cassius, Calgar determined that Sicarius would undergo a period of observation and reintegration before resuming any command responsibilities. This decision represented a significant shift in Sicarius's trajectory within the chapter. Before his disappearance, he had been widely considered Calgar's most likely successor as chapter master, his combination of battlefield prowess and strategic acumen marking him as exemplary even among the Ultramarines officer corps. Now, his status became ambiguous, neither removed from duty nor fully restored to his former position. The reintegration process began with Sicarius joining training exercises as an observer rather than participant. From the elevated platforms overlooking the practice cages in Fortress Hera, he watched squads of battle brothers drilling in combat maneuvers, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Sergeants who glanced up at his silent figure reported an unsettling sensation, not of being judged, as might have been expected from the pre-warp Sicarius, but of being truly seen, as if the captain perceived aspects of their performance invisible to conventional observation. When Sicarius finally returned to active training, his combat style showed dramatic evolution. The flamboyant swordsmanship that had once characterized his approach gave way to a stripped-down efficiency that emphasized minimal movement and perfect timing. During sparring matches, he defeated opponents not through the overwhelming aggression of his earlier years, but through an uncanny ability to identify and exploit the precise moment when their defenses became vulnerable. Several veteran sergeants noted that fighting against the new Sicarius felt like confronting an opponent who could perceive their intentions microseconds before they themselves became aware of them. Perhaps the most notable change manifested in Sicarius's pre-battle rituals. Before his warp ordeal, he had approached combat with confident directness, his preparations focused primarily on weapons maintenance and strategic review. Now he engaged in elaborate preparatory ceremonies that combined elements of traditional ultramarine battle meditation with practices unknown to the chapter's chaplains. Hours before deployment, he would withdraw to private chambers, where witnesses reported hearing him reciting what sounded like mathematical formulae in archaic dialects of High Gothic, occasionally interspersed with periods of absolute silence lasting exactly 17 minutes. His armor underwent modifications reflecting these new concerns. Working with Techmarine Fenias, Sicarius incorporated additional warding symbols into his armor's surface, some drawn from standard Adeptus Astartes protective iconography, while others represented more obscure traditions preserved in the chapter's oldest texts. The helm received particular attention, with microscopic inscriptions covering its interior surface in patterns that Fenias described as designed to filter certain frequencies of perception. When questioned about these modifications, Sicarius would only state that they maintained alignment between observed and actual reality. The first true test of the changed Sicarius came during the Drenthal campaign against a Genestealer cult uprising. The mining world's subterranean complexes had been infiltrated over several generations, with cult influence extending into the planetary defense forces and governance structure. Initial Imperial Guard deployments had become bogged down in the labyrinthine tunnel networks, suffering heavy casualties from ambushes and sabotage. The Ultramarines committed 3 squads from the 2nd Company under Sicarius's command to eliminate the cult leadership and secure critical infrastructure. Tactical planning sessions for this operation revealed fundamental shifts in Sicarius's approach. Where he had once favored decisive strikes at what appeared to be enemy centers of gravity, he now devoted extensive attention to peripheral factors, atmospheric composition in different tunnel sections, harmonic resonance patterns in the mining equipment, and circadian rhythms of the local population. When Captain Ixion of the 2nd Company questioned the relevance of these considerations, Sicarius explained that conventional spatial relationships represent only one dimension of tactical reality. The operation itself demonstrated the effectiveness of this altered perspective. Rather than deploying directly against known cult concentrations, Sicarius positioned his forces at seemingly random junctions throughout the tunnel network. These positions made little sense according to standard tactical doctrine until the cult forces began their counterattack, at which point the Ultramarine deployments revealed themselves as perfectly situated to intercept enemy movements that had not yet begun when the positions were established. Most striking was Sicarius's personal combat performance during an encounter with the cult patriarch in the central spawning chamber. The hybrid creature, a monstrous amalgamation of human and tyrannid characteristics, possessed both tremendous physical power and psychic abilities that had overwhelmed previous Imperial forces. Sicarius approached this formidable opponent with methodical precision, his movements following patterns that witnesses later struggled to describe coherently, each step and strike occurring at intervals that seemed to disrupt the creature's psychic precognition. The duel lasted less than 2 minutes, but unfolded with a strange temporal quality that made it seem both longer and shorter to different observers. The Patriarch launched multiple attacks that should have struck Sicarius directly, yet each time the captain was somehow no longer at the targeted position when the blow landed. His own strikes, rather than the dramatic killing blows characteristic of his earlier combat style, consisted of precisely calculated cuts to specific nerve clusters and synaptic nodes, gradually degrading the creature's combat effectiveness until a final thrust to its central brain cluster ended the confrontation. In the operation's aftermath, Battle brothers who had served under Sicarius before his disappearance noted the most significant change in his leadership approach. The captain, who had once sought the glory of leading from the front, now positioned himself where he could best coordinate the overall flow of combat, sometimes removing himself from direct engagement to maintain strategic oversight. His tactical directions became increasingly abstract, often describing enemy movements before they occurred or directing squads to secure locations that appeared insignificant until subsequent developments revealed their importance. Chapter Master Calgar, reviewing reports from the Drenthal campaign, recognized both the value and potential concern in these developments. Sicarius's enhanced tactical awareness represented an undeniable asset, yet the intuitive nature of his insights raised questions about their source. After consultation with the Librarius, Calgar implemented a new protocol for operations under Sicarius's command. Each mission would include a librarian whose responsibility included monitoring the captain's psychic status during combat operations. The first implementation of this protocol came during the defense of Quintarn against Dark Eldar raiders. Librarian Severus accompanied Sicarius's strike force as they intercepted Drukhari vessels, attacking agricultural settlements across the planet's southern continent. The Xenos employed their characteristic hit-and-run tactics, using webway portals to appear without warning, capture slaves, and disappear before significant resistance could be organized. Sicarius countered these tactics with an approach that seemed to anticipate the raiders' movements with impossible precision. Rather than attempting to defend all potential targets, a strategy that would have dispersed his forces too thinly to be effective, he positioned concentrated strike teams at locations that initially appeared randomly selected. In each case, these positions intercepted Dark Eldar forces emerging from webway gates that had not been active or even detected when the Ultramarines deployed. Librarian Severus, observing Sicarius throughout this operation, reported a disturbing phenomenon. During tactical briefings, the captain would occasionally pause mid-sentence, his eyes focusing on empty sections of the command tent as if perceiving entities invisible to others present. When questioned about these incidents, Sicarius acknowledged them without concern, explaining that he was observing probability currents that informed his tactical decisions. Severus noted that these episodes corresponded precisely with subsequent adjustments to deployment plans that invariably proved crucial to the operation's success. Most revealing was Sicarius's confrontation with the Dark Eldar Archon leading the raid. The Xenos commander, a being of ancient cunning named Vrisk the Deathless, had survived centuries of both external conflicts and internal Camorra politics through preternatural combat skill and tactical foresight. When Ultramarine forces cornered his raiding party near an active webway portal, Vrisk emerged to personally engage the Space Marines while his forces prepared to retreat. Sicarius approached this duel with none of the ceremonial challenge or dramatic flourish that might once have characterized such an encounter. Instead, he initiated combat with a series of apparently miscalculated strikes that exposed his guard to counterattack, moves so uncharacteristic of an Astartes captain that they momentarily confused the Archon. This confusion proved intentional when Sicarius's seemingly erratic pattern suddenly resolved into a precisely calculated sequence that exploited minute gaps in the Dark Eldar's defense. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, ending when Sicarius's power sword found the exact junction between the Archon's armor plates, a vulnerability that should have been impossible to identify without intimate knowledge of Dark Eldar craftsmanship. As Vrisk fell, his final expression showed not pain but bewilderment, as if facing something that defied his extensive experience of combat against Imperial forces. Roboute Guilliman, returning to Muck Crag after campaigns in the Imperium Nihilus, took particular interest in reports of Sicarius's altered tactical approach. The Primarch requested a private audience with the captain, a meeting that lasted nearly 6 hours, and from which no transcript was preserved in chapter records. Witnesses reported that Guilliman emerged from this conference with an expression of deep contemplation, while Sicarius appeared unusually subdued, as if having received information that required extensive processing. Following this meeting, Guilliman issued a directive regarding Sicarius's deployment that reflected both appreciation of his unique capabilities and concern about their implications. The captain would resume command responsibilities within the chapter, but would operate with specific limitations. His authority confined to precisely defined mission parameters with regular assessment by both chaplains and librarians. Additionally, Guilliman assigned Sicarius to develop specialized training protocols for Astartes facing warp-influenced adversaries, leveraging his experiences without placing him in situations where his altered perceptions might lead to unpredictable decisions. This balanced approach characterized Sicarius's reintegration into the chapter's command structure. His tactical insights proved invaluable in multiple campaigns, particularly against adversaries with warp connections like Chaos Space Marines and demonic entities. During the Purging of Connor, Sicarius's strike force eliminated a word-bearer's ritual site with unprecedented efficiency. His understanding of the arcane geometries involved allowing him to identify and neutralize key components before the ritual could be completed. Simultaneously, the chapter maintained vigilant monitoring of Sicarius's mental state. Chaplain Cassius established a regular schedule of spiritual assessments designed to detect any erosion of the captain's connection to imperial truth. These sessions revealed a more introspective Sicarius, one who questioned fundamental aspects of reality that most Astartes accepted without examination. While these philosophical explorations occasionally approached heretical territory, they never crossed into actual rejection of imperial doctrine, instead representing what Cassius described as a mind attempting to reconcile irreconcilable perceptions. The most profound indicator of Sicarius's transformation manifested in his interactions with junior battle brothers. Before his warp ordeal, he had been known for demanding perfection through intimidation and example, his leadership style emphasizing the unbridgeable gap between his abilities and those of his subordinates. The returned Sicarius displayed unexpected patience with younger Marines, particularly those struggling with the psychological burdens of combat. Veterans observed him spending hours with battle brothers experiencing combat trauma, his counsel focusing not on stoic suppression of such reactions, but on integrating them into a more complete understanding of warfare's reality. The battlefield tactics of Cato Sicarius evolved significantly throughout his career, developing into what many Ultramarine strategists now study as the Sicarius pattern assault protocols. Unlike many of his contemporaries who adhered rigidly to the letter of the Codex Astartes, Sicarius approached Guilliman's tactical treatise as a foundation to be built upon rather than an immutable scripture. This perspective allowed him to develop innovative combat methodologies while maintaining the core principles that define the Ultramarines as a fighting force. The most distinctive element of Sicarius's battle doctrine centered on speed and decisive action. Where traditional Codex doctrine emphasized methodical advance with consolidated forces, Sicarius preferred rapid strikes at critical vulnerabilities, accepting calculated risks to achieve decisive results. His approach stemmed from a fundamental belief that combat effectiveness diminished exponentially with duration. The longer a battle continued, the more variables could disrupt even the most carefully constructed plans. This philosophy manifested most clearly in what became known as the spear thrust deployment. Rather than distributing forces evenly across a battlefront, Sicarius concentrated elite elements into a narrow-profile assault formation that could penetrate enemy lines at their weakest point. The formation typically arranged assault marines at the tip, followed by tactical squads in tight diamond patterns, with heavy weapons teams positioned at specific intervals to provide supporting fire along the flanks. The effectiveness of this approach depended on precise timing and coordination. Sicarius developed enhanced training protocols for the Second Company that emphasized split-second decision-making and communication under extreme stress. Battle Brothers would drill for hundreds of hours in simulated environments where conditions changed unpredictably, forcing them to adapt standard tactics to unforeseen circumstances without losing cohesion. Those who could not maintain both discipline and flexibility were transferred to other companies where more conventional combat doctrines prevailed. These drills often took place in the notorious labyrinth chambers beneath Fortress Hera. Originally constructed as emergency shelter systems, Sicarius repurposed these winding corridors as training grounds where environmental conditions could be altered without warning. Gravity plates might suddenly reverse polarity, section lighting could fail completely, or atmospheric composition might change to simulate toxic environments. Battle Brothers learned to function effectively regardless of external conditions, developing a resilience that proved invaluable during actual deployments. Physical conditioning under Sicarius's regimen went beyond even the rigorous standards expected of Astartes. He instituted what many Battle Brothers darkly referred to as the Gauntlet, a weekly endurance trial that pushed transhuman physiology to its absolute limits. The exact components varied, but typically included sustained combat exercises while wearing unpowered armor, high-gravity resistance training, and reflex enhancement drills using live ammunition with minimal protective equipment. Medical monitoring during these sessions frequently recorded stress levels that approached dangerous thresholds. Yet Sicarius insisted that operating at physiological limits in training prevented catastrophic failures during actual combat. Theoretical instruction complemented this physical preparation. Sicarius personally conducted tactical seminars where Battle Brothers analyzed historical engagements, identifying decision points where alternative approaches might have yielded superior outcomes. Unlike traditional Codex instruction that emphasized established solutions, Sicarius's teaching method focused on developing analytical frameworks that could generate novel responses to unprecedented situations. Battle Brothers were encouraged to challenge conventional wisdom, provided they could support their alternative approaches with sound tactical reasoning. The equipment preferences of the Second Company under Sicarius reflected this combat philosophy. Where other companies might maintain a balanced distribution of weaponry, Sicarius favored loadouts that maximized mobility and striking power. Tactical squads typically carried a higher proportion of special weapons than Codex standards recommended, sacrificing sustained firepower for the ability to deliver devastating initial strikes. Vehicle support emphasized fast-moving platforms like land speeders and assault bikes over heavier, but slower Predator tanks or Vindicators, allowing the company to rapidly redeploy as battlefield conditions evolved. Sicarius's personal wargear embodied this approach to combat. His Artificer Power armor, crafted by Master Techmarine Phineas, incorporated numerous modifications that prioritized speed and sensory acuity over additional protection. The armor's auto senses had been calibrated to process information at rates that would overwhelm standard Astartes' neural interfaces, providing Sicarius with battlefield awareness that bordered on precognitive. Servo motors in the leg plates contained additional fiber bundles that increased response speed by approximately 0.3 seconds, a seemingly minor improvement that nevertheless could prove decisive in close-quarters combat. The armor's most distinctive feature was its power distribution system, where standard Astartes' plate maintained relatively even energy allocation across all systems. Sicarius's armor incorporated what Techmarine Fenias termed dynamic prioritization matrices. These systems could instantaneously redirect power from non-essential functions to specific subsystems based on combat needs, boosting shield strength against incoming fire or enhancing servo response during melee engagements. This adaptability came at the cost of increased maintenance requirements and shorter operational duration, trade-offs Sicarius considered acceptable for the tactical advantages gained. His primary weapon, often incorrectly identified in Imperial records as the Tempest Blade, was actually a master-crafted power sword whose official designation in chapter armory logs was Honor's Edge. The weapon featured a modified disruption field generator that operated at frequencies slightly higher than standard power weapons, creating an effect that could penetrate energy shields and conversion fields more effectively than conventional blades. This modification made the weapon particularly effective against heavily armored opponents or Xenos with advanced defensive technologies. Complementing his blade, Sicarius typically carried a plasma pistol modified to address the weapon's tendency toward dangerous overheating. Working with Techmarine Fenias, he had incorporated additional heat sinks into the pistol's frame and modified its containment field generators to allow more rapid cooling between discharges. These changes permitted sustained fire at maximum power settings with reduced risk of catastrophic failure, though still requiring disciplined trigger control to prevent cumulative heat buildup during extended engagements. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Sicarius's battle doctrine was his approach to command structure within the Second Company. Traditional codex organization established a relatively straightforward hierarchy, with the captain issuing orders to squad sergeants, who then directed their battle brothers accordingly. Sicarius implemented a more nuanced system that he termed distributed command authority, a framework that allowed for greater tactical flexibility while maintaining overall strategic coherence. Under this system, Sicarius assigned specific tactical domains to his most experienced sergeants, granting them considerable autonomy within their designated areas of responsibility. Sergeant Vorlanis, a veteran of 3 centuries service with extensive experience in urban warfare, typically oversaw operations in built-up areas. Sergeant Coronian, whose background included specialized training with the Death Watch, handled Xeno-specific tactical adjustments. Sergeant Agamemnon, later promoted to captain of the First Company, coordinated heavy weapons deployment and fire support planning. This distribution of tactical authority allowed Sicarius to focus on overall strategic direction rather than micromanaging individual squad deployments. During major engagements, he would establish clear operational parameters and objectives, then allow his sergeants to determine the specific methods for achieving these goals based on evolving battlefield conditions. This approach created a more responsive command structure that could adapt to changing circumstances without requiring constant direction from above. To support this command philosophy, Sicarius instituted specialized communication protocols that streamlined information flow during combat operations. Rather than routing all tactical data through the company command net, squad sergeants maintained direct channels with one another, sharing real-time intelligence and coordinating their movements without central mediation. Sicarius monitored these exchanges, but intervened only when necessary to redirect efforts or resolve conflicting priorities. This communication framework extended to inter-unit coordination as well. When operating alongside other Imperial forces, Sicarius assigned liaison officers with specific responsibility for synchronizing Second Company operations with Guard regiments, Mechanicus contingents, or other Space Marine chapters. These liaisons received extensive diplomatic training beyond standard Astartes preparation, enabling them to navigate the complex political considerations that often complicated joint operations without requiring Sicarius's direct involvement. The most innovative aspect of Sicarius's command structure was his development of specialized strike teams drawn from across the company's squads. Rather than maintaining rigid squad compositions as prescribed by the Codex, he would occasionally reconfigure his forces into mission-specific units, combining warriors with complementary skills. A typical strike team might include close combat specialists from assault squads, heavy weapons operators from devastator squads, and veterans from tactical squads, creating balanced forces optimized for particular mission profiles. These composite units receive designation by color rather than numerical assignment: Gold Team, Azure Team, Crimson Team, to distinguish them from standard squad structures. Each operated under the command of a designated strike leader, typically a veteran sergeant selected for expertise relevant to the specific mission rather than standard hierarchical position. This approach allowed Sicarius to leverage the full spectrum of skills available within the company without being constrained by traditional organizational boundaries. The effectiveness of this flexible command structure became apparent during the Purging of Orleans, where Second Company forces faced a chaos warband employing unconventional tactics. When initial engagements revealed the enemy utilizing captured Imperial vehicles as mobile plague dispensers, Sicarius rapidly assembled specialized hunter-killer teams combining melta-weapon specialists, technical experts capable of disabling vehicle systems, and close combat veterans to eliminate crews. These composite units neutralized the plague vehicles with minimal civilian casualties, adapting their approach based on field experience rather than waiting for revised orders from command levels. Training for this distributed command system required significant modifications to standard Astartes preparation. Sicarius instituted regular command rotation exercises where battle brothers temporarily assumed leadership roles regardless of their formal rank. Even relatively junior Marines might find themselves directing veterans during these drills, forcing them to develop decision-making skills and command presence, while teaching more experienced warriors to function effectively under diverse leadership styles. The result was a company where virtually any battle brother could step into a command role if circumstances required, creating remarkable resilience against decapitation strikes or communication disruption. This approach was not without controversy within the chapter. Captain Guilliman of the First Company frequently questioned whether Sicarius's innovations represented improvements to Codex doctrine or dangerous deviations from proven methods. Chaplain Cassius expressed concern that emphasizing individual initiative might undermine the collective discipline that defined the Ultramarines as a fighting force. Even Chapter Master Calgar occasionally noted that Sicarius's methods, while undeniably effective under his personal leadership, might prove difficult to sustain under a different commander. Sicarius addressed these concerns by meticulously documenting both the theoretical foundations and practical applications of his tactical innovations. His treatise, Adaptive Implementation of Codex Principles in Evolving Warfare Environments, provided comprehensive analysis of how his modifications aligned with the underlying logic of Guilliman's original work, even when specific applications diverged from literal interpretation. By framing his innovations as extensions of Codex philosophy rather than rejections of it, he gradually gained acceptance for his methods among the chapter's more traditionally minded officers. The practical results spoke eloquently in favor of Sicarius's approach. Under his command, the Second Company maintained one of the highest operational success rates in the chapter's history, accomplishing objectives that often seemed beyond the capabilities of a single company. During the Damnos campaign, Sicarius's forces held out against Necron numerical superiority that should have overwhelmed them according to conventional tactical calculations. On Black Reach, they dismantled an Orkwa through precisely targeted strikes, rather than the war of attrition that typically characterized anti-greenskin operations. Perhaps the most significant testament to the effectiveness of Sicarius's battle doctrine came in its adoption by other imperial forces. Elements of his rapid strike methodology were incorporated into Adeptus Mechanicus Scitarii tactical protocols following joint operations during the Damno's reclamation. Several Astra Militarum regiments with close ties to the Ultramarines began implementing modified versions of his distributed command structure, adapted to account for the limitations of unaugmented human operators. Even other Space Marine chapters, particularly Ultramarine successors like the Nova Marines and Genesis chapter, sent officers to observe Second Company operations and incorporate compatible elements into their own combat doctrines. The training regimen Sicarius developed for the Second Company produced warriors with a distinctive combat profile, disciplined yet adaptive, technically proficient yet innovative in application. Veterans of his command were highly sought after as instructors throughout the chapter, their experience under his leadership providing insights that could not be gained from standard codex training alone. Many went on to leadership positions in other companies, spreading elements of Sicarius's tactical philosophy throughout the Ultramarines command structure. The legacy of Cato Sicarius within the Ultramarines chapter remains a subject of intense debate among imperial scholars and Astartes historians alike. His position in the chapter's storied history stands at a complex intersection, neither fully aligned with the traditionalist exemplars like First Captain Guilliman, nor entirely comparable to the more unorthodox approaches of officers like Uriel Ventris of the Fourth Company. This ambiguous standing reflects both his remarkable achievements and the controversies that have followed his career trajectory. When measured against other legendary Ultramarine officers, Sicarius occupies a distinctive niche. First Captain Sevastus Guilliman, Master of the Watch and commander of the veteran First Company, represents the chapter's traditional ideal, methodical, disciplined, and unwavering in his adherence to Codex principles. Guilliman's leadership style emphasizes collective action and careful planning, with personal glory subordinated to chapter objectives. His tactical approach rarely generates the spectacular victories associated with Sicarius, but neither does it produce the occasional catastrophic setbacks. The contrast with Chief Librarian Tigurius presents another interesting comparison. Unlike Sicarius, whose battlefield prowess centers on physical combat and tactical innovation, Tigurius wields psychic abilities of unprecedented potency. His contribution to the chapter extends beyond direct combat to include strategic forecasting and counter-warp operations that have proven crucial during encounters with Chaos forces and Tyranid hive fleets. Where Sicarius leads from the front with blade and bolter, Tigurius shapes the battlefield through psychic manipulation and prescient guidance, representing a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Perhaps the most illuminating comparison comes with Captain Uriel Ventris of the Fourth Company, whose career has followed a trajectory that occasionally paralleled Sicarius's, but with markedly different outcomes. Both officers have demonstrated willingness to adapt Codex principles to meet unexpected challenges, yet their methods diverge significantly. Where Sicarius modifies tactical applications while maintaining the appearance of Codex orthodoxy, Ventris has openly challenged certain doctrinal elements when circumstances demanded, even accepting exile to the death oath for his departures from tradition. This fundamental difference between adaptive interpretation and occasional outright deviation reflects their distinct perspectives on the nature of the Codex itself. The scholarly debate regarding Sicarius's worthiness as a potential future chapter master has intensified following Guilliman's return. Prior to the Primarch's reawakening, many within the chapter hierarchy viewed Sicarius as Calgar's most likely successor, despite concerns about his occasionally excessive individualism. His combat record and tactical acumen provided strong arguments in his favor, while his aristocratic background and natural charisma made him well-suited to the diplomatic aspects of chapter leadership. Guilliman's assessment has introduced new dimensions to this debate. The Primarch's initial assignment of Sicarius to his personal guard, rather than returning him to company command, suggested a desire to reshape the captain's leadership approach. Under Guilliman's direct supervision, Sicarius has demonstrated increasing strategic sophistication and greater appreciation for the broader imperial context within which Astartes operations occur. This evolution has led some scholars to suggest that Guilliman is deliberately preparing Sicarius for higher command, using personal mentorship to temper the captain's more problematic tendencies while enhancing his considerable strengths. Critics within the Ordo Astartes, however, point to Sicarius's warp experiences as a potentially disqualifying factor for chapter master consideration. The subtle but significant changes in his personality and tactical approach following his return raise questions about his long-term psychological stability. While Chief Librarian Tigurius has repeatedly confirmed the absence of chaotic taint or demonic influence, the possibility remains that Sicarius's altered perspectives might lead to unpredictable decision-making under the pressures of chapter-level command. The influence Sicarius has exerted on younger Ultramarine officers represents perhaps his most significant contribution to the chapter's future. Over his decades of service, particularly as captain of the Second Company, he has directly shaped the development of hundreds of Astartes who have passed through his command. Many now serve as sergeants and lieutenants throughout the chapter, carrying elements of his tactical philosophy into their own leadership roles. This influence has given rise to what Ultramarine training officers informally term the Sicarian school of tactical thought. Officers associated with this approach typically demonstrate greater emphasis on mobility and decisive action than traditional Codex doctrine might suggest. They show marked preference for rapid strike operations over protracted engagements, and often display willingness to accept calculated risks when potential rewards justify such gambles. While maintaining proper respect for Codex principles, these officers approach Guilliman's tactical writings as guidelines to be thoughtfully applied rather than rigid prescriptions to be followed without question. The spread of these tendencies throughout the chapter has created a subtle but meaningful evolution in Ultramarine combat doctrine. Training protocols increasingly incorporate elements first developed under Sicarius's command, particularly his emphasis on adaptive response to unexpected battlefield developments. The Labyrinth Chambers training methodology has been implemented across multiple companies, producing battle brothers capable of maintaining both discipline and initiative when confronted with scenarios not explicitly addressed in the Codex. Notably, this influence extends beyond tactical applications to include leadership philosophy. Officers trained under Sicarius typically demonstrate greater willingness to delegate authority to subordinates, creating command structures that can function effectively even when communications are compromised or senior leaders become casualties. This distributed leadership model represents a significant departure from traditional Astartes hierarchy, potentially increasing overall force resilience while sacrificing some degree of centralized control. The integration of Primaris Marines into the Ultramarines has provided an unexpected vehicle for Sicarius's influence to spread more rapidly throughout the chapter. Many of these new warriors, lacking the ingrained traditions of established battle brothers, have proven particularly receptive to Sicarius's innovative approaches. Their enhanced physical capabilities align naturally with his emphasis on rapid deployment and decisive engagement, creating a generation of Astartes particularly well-suited to implementing his tactical vision. Guilliman appears to have recognized this synergy, frequently assigning Primaris heavy detachments to operations under Sicarius's command. These deployments serve multiple purposes, providing the new warriors with exposure to experienced leadership while allowing Sicarius to develop tactical applications specifically leveraging Primaris capabilities. The resulting combat doctrines, documented in supplements to the Codex Imperialis, represent some of the most effective integrations of traditional Astartes tactics with the enhanced potential of Primaris physiology. The Primarch's apparent plans for Sicarius within the broader context of the Indomitus Crusade suggest recognition of both his capabilities and his limitations. Rather than placing him in overall command of major campaign elements, roles typically assigned to chapter masters or experienced lord commanders, Guilliman has repeatedly deployed Sicarius as a troubleshooter for particularly challenging tactical situations. This approach leverages his exceptional battlefield acumen and adaptive thinking while maintaining him within a command structure that provides appropriate oversight. Several deployments during the Crusade's second phase illustrate this pattern. At Parmenio, when Chaos forces employed previously undocumented warp tech that rendered conventional void shields ineffective, Sicarius was assigned to develop countermeasures rather than overall command of the campaign. His solution, involving precisely calibrated oscillating power distributions that prevented the enemy technology from establishing resonance with shield generators, demonstrated his talent for unconventional problem solving without requiring him to manage the broader strategic operation. Similarly, during the liberation of the Odoser system, Guilliman tasked Sicarius with neutralizing a Death Guard biological research facility while placing overall campaign command under Lord Commander Valorous of the Adeptus Custodes. This arrangement allowed Sicarius to focus his attention on the specific tactical challenge presented by the Plague facility, a task requiring exactly the sort of adaptive thinking at which he excels, while leaving strategic coordination to officers whose temperament better suited that role. This pattern suggests Guilliman envisions a specialized future role for Sicarius within the reformed Imperium, neither the chapter master position many once expected, nor a limited combat role that would waste his considerable talents. Instead, the Primarch appears to be grooming him for a position combining advisory responsibilities with direct intervention capability, potentially as part of the command structure for ongoing Crusade operations against specific threat categories, where his particular insights prove most valuable. Speculation among Imperial strategists suggests Sicarius might eventually assume command of specialized task forces focused on threats requiring unconventional responses, particularly those involving warp-influenced adversaries. His experiences during his time lost in the Immaterium, while potentially problematic for conventional command roles, provide unique perspective on such enemies that few other Imperial commanders can match. Combined with his tactical brilliance and combat prowess, this specialized knowledge could make him exceptionally effective against certain categories of opponents. The possibility also exists that Guilliman intends Sicarius for a role within the emerging Primaris command structure. As increasing numbers of these enhanced Astartes join the fight across the Imperium, the need grows for experienced officers who understand both traditional Astartes combat doctrine and the unique capabilities of Primaris warriors. Sicarius's demonstrated ability to integrate these elements effectively could position him as an ideal candidate for leadership positions within predominantly Primaris formations, particularly those drawn from multiple chapters, where his Ultramarine background would provide valuable doctrinal foundation. Whatever specific role Guilliman envisions, Sicarius's future appears increasingly tied to the broader Imperial restoration rather than solely to Ultramarine operations. His deployments increasingly involve coordination with diverse Imperial forces, from Adeptus Mechanicus battle congregations to Astra Militarum strike forces, suggesting development of the inter-organizational coordination skills necessary for higher command in the reformed Imperium. This expanded scope represents significant evolution from his earlier career, where his focus remained primarily on Astartes-centric operations with limited consideration for other Imperial elements. The ultimate legacy of Cato Sicarius remains unwritten, dependent on both his future actions and the broader course of the Imperium's struggle against its myriad enemies. What can be said with certainty is that he represents a transitional figure within Astartes history, a warrior whose career bridges the pre- and post-Guilliman eras, incorporating elements of both traditional Space Marine doctrine and the evolving requirements of the Imperium Reborn. His influence on tactical thinking, leadership philosophy, and Astartes culture will continue to shape Ultramarine operations long after his active service concludes. For the immediate future, Sicarius continues to serve where the Primarch directs, applying his considerable talents to the challenges of an Imperium facing unprecedented threats on multiple fronts. His experiences, both triumphant and traumatic, have forged him into a warrior unlike any other in the Ultramarines' long history. Neither the flawless hero of propagandist accounts nor the glory-seeking individualist portrayed by his critics, the true Cato Sicarius stands as a complex figure whose greatest contributions to the Imperium may still lie ahead. As Guilliman's grand designs for the reformed Imperium continue to unfold, the role of exceptional individuals like Sicarius becomes increasingly crucial. In an era where traditional imperial institutions strain under unprecedented pressures, warriors capable of adaptive thinking and decisive action represent essential assets in humanity's ongoing struggle for survival. Whether as future chapter master, specialized commander, or in some role not yet defined, Cato Sicarius will undoubtedly continue to shape imperial history through the application of his unique capabilities and perspective. The Grand Duke of Talisar, Master of the Watch, Knight Champion of Macragge, these titles reflect Sicarius's past achievements. His future legacy, however, will be determined not by honors already earned, but by his response to the challenges that still await in a galaxy where even the light of the astronomician struggles against encroaching darkness. For Cato Sicarius, as for the Imperium itself, the greatest tests may yet lie ahead.